Good evening and welcome. Settle in. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head and let your shoulders come down away from your ears, and let the day you have just finished begin to loosen its grip on you, one small hinge at a time. There is nothing here that will startle you. There is nothing in the next several hours that will raise its voice. This is a long, slow, unhurried telling of one of the great stories of our species, and it is told at the pace of a person walking through warm air with nowhere in particular to be. If you fall asleep in the first 10 minutes, you have used this recording exactly as it was intended. If you drift out and drift back in an hour from now, and find us somewhere in the middle of a rainforest, in the middle of a dynasty, with a name you have never heard being spoken gently, that is also exactly right. You are not being tested. You are only being kept company. Tonight we are going to tell the entire story of the Maya. Not a fragment of it, not one famous ruin photographed from a helicopter, but the whole long arc, from the first wild grass in a highland valley to the cities in the trees, to the century in which the great southern courts fell quiet, to the northern cities that came afterward, to the ships on the horizon, to the long silence, to the slow patient work of reading the writing again, and to the millions of people who speak Mayan languages this very evening, cooking supper, putting children to bed, laughing at something on a telephone screen, entirely alive. It is a story of about 3,000 years, and we have all the time we need. Let us begin, as every story of a people has to begin, with the ground under their feet. Picture a shelf of pale limestone, enormous, lifted out of a warm sea a very long time ago, and set down at the place where North America narrows and hands itself to South America. That shelf is the Yucatan Peninsula, and it is a strange and beautiful thing. Limestone is a soft, thirsty stone. Rain falls on it, and rather than running off in rivers the way water does in most of the world, the water sinks. It goes down through the rock, dissolving it slowly, patiently, over hundreds of thousands of years, hollowing out rooms and corridors and cathedrals in the dark. In the flat north of the peninsula, there are almost no rivers at all. There are no streams to follow, no lakes to camp beside. And yet there is water everywhere, just out of reach, moving quietly through the stone beneath your sandals. Here and there the roof of one of those hidden chambers falls in, and a circle of the surface drops away, and what is left is a well of astonishing clarity. A round mouth in the earth with cool green water at the bottom and roots hanging down the walls like ropes left by someone who has gone. The Maya called these openings zonot, and the Spanish heard that and wrote it as cenote, and that is the word we use now. There are thousands of them. Some are narrow and shy, hidden under a tangle of vine. Some are wide enough to hold a village festival on the rim. To live in the northern lowlands was to live in a landscape organised entirely around these openings, because where the water was, the people were, and every settlement of any size grew up within an easy walk of one. Now move south, away from that dry flat scrubland, and the country begins to gather itself. The trees get taller, the air gets thicker and sweeter. You are entering the Piton and the southern lowlands, and this is rainforest of the sort that closes over your head like a cathedral roof. Mahogany and ceiba and sapodilla and breadnut, 100 feet and more into the air, and beneath them a green half-light, and howler monkeys in the canopy making a sound like distant wind through a cave, and toucans, and parrots, and 1,000 kinds of insect keeping time. Here there is standing water, seasonal swamps the Maya call bajos, shallow depressions that fill in the wet season and crack in the dry. Here there are true rivers at last, the Usumacinta braiding down toward the Gulf, the Passion, the Motagua, the Belize, and along those rivers a canoe could carry more cargo in a day than 20 people could carry on their backs in a week. And south again, higher, the land rises hard into the volcanic highlands of what is now Guatemala and Chiapas, cool country, pine and cloud, valleys of extraordinarily rich black soil, and mountains that occasionally cleared their throats and reminded everyone who was truly in charge. That highland spine gave the lowlands the things the lowlands could not make, It gave obsidian volcanic glass that flakes to an edge finer than surgical steel. It gave jade, the green stone the Maya loved above all other substances on earth, more than gold, more than silver, because green was the colour of young maize, and of water, and of breath itself. It gave the quetzal, the small trembling bird with a tail of iridescent emerald a metre long, whose feathers were plucked, and whose life was spared, and whose plumes rode in bundles down the trade roads to be worn by kings. 3 countries in one region then, the dry cenote north, the green lowland middle, the cool volcanic south, and threading between them the coast, with its salt flats and its lagoons, and its long sheltered canoe route running all the way around the peninsula like a road nobody had to build. Modern borders cut across all of it. Today the Maya world lies in 5 nations: Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, and none of those lines existed when this story was made. Hold the whole thing in your mind as one country, because that is what it was. A single conversation carried on for 3,000 years across a landscape about the size of Italy. And now the weather, because the weather is the hinge on which so much of this turns. There are 2 seasons. There is the rain from roughly May to January, when the sky goes the colour of a bruise every afternoon and lets down a warm vertical downpour, and everything drinks. And there is the dry, from February to April, when the leaves go crisp, and the boughs crack, and the water level in the cenotes drops, and everyone watches the sky with a kind of polite anxiety. Every field, every reservoir, every plastered plaza sloped just so to catch runoff, every roof, every ritual, every prayer painted onto a pot was built around the arrival of that rain. When it came on time, the world was generous beyond belief. 3 crops in some years, fruit falling from trees nobody had planted. When it came late, or thin, or not at all, the whole beautiful machine held its breath. Keep that in your mind. We will come back to it in a few hours, when we get to the century that everyone calls the collapse, and you will find that the rain has been standing quietly in the corner of the room the entire time. So that is the stage. Limestone, water underground, rainforest, volcano, and a sky that decides. Onto that stage, tonight we are going to walk perhaps 100 generations of people. Farmers, mostly overwhelmingly farmers, as every ancient society was overwhelmingly farmers, but also scribes who could write anything that could be said in their language, with a system as flexible as our own. Astronomers who tracked the planet Venus across 5 centuries and knew where it would be with an error of about 2 hours. Mathematicians who used a symbol for 0 as a working number, while much of the world was still counting on fingers and tally marks. Architects who raised pyramids taller than a 20-story building, with no metal tools, no draft animals, and no wheels in use for hauling. Potters, weavers, salt boilers, feather workers, jade carvers, canoe men, midwives, daykeepers, ball players, kings and queens, whose names we can now speak aloud again after 1,200 years of not being able to. That last part is worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further, because it is one of the quietly astonishing facts of this whole story. For most of the time that outsiders have known these ruins existed, we could not read a word of them. The stones were covered in beautiful, dense, obviously meaningful signs, and they were as opaque as a locked door. Scholars insisted for decades that the writing said nothing personal at all, that it was purely a record of time and stars, that these were peaceful priest astronomers with no history worth the name. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, a handful of people in different countries, working in different languages, some of them without ever meeting, cracked it open. And what came pouring out was not abstraction, it was history. Birth dates, accession dates, the names of mothers, marriages between cities, wars and defeats, and the exact day a king was captured, a grandmother's title, a boy's first bloodletting. The story went from being a set of anonymous monuments to being a story with people in it, and it happened within living memory. Some of the people who did that work are still alive. We will spend a good while with them near the end, when you are, I suspect, already asleep. But since we are here at the beginning, and since a beginning is the right place to say the most important thing, let us settle one matter now, before we go back 3,000 years. It is the thing almost everybody gets wrong about the Maya, and it is the reason this story is not a tragedy. Here it is, plainly. The Maya did not vanish. They did not disappear. There was no last Maya, no final closing of a door. At this moment, tonight, while you are lying in the dark listening to a stranger's voice, there are somewhere between 6 and 7 million people alive who identify as Maya, and about 30 distinct Mayan languages being spoken in kitchens and markets and schoolrooms and taxicabs across southern Mexico and Guatemala and Belize and Honduras. Yucatec Maya, spoken by around 750,000 people on the very peninsula we just described. Quiche and Cachical, and Mam and Chechi in the Guatemalan highlands, each with hundreds of thousands of speakers. Tzotzil and Celtal in Chiapas. Chol, Chorti, Mopan, Itza, Lacandan, Ixil, Pocomam, Toyolabal, Chuj, Jacultec, and more. Children learn these languages first and Spanish second. Radio stations broadcast in them. Novels and poetry are written in them. Weavers in the highlands still put onto cloth the same diamond that stands for the world with a sun rising along its edge, and if you ask them what it means, they will tell you, because the meaning was never lost, only unnoticed by the people who were not looking. So when you hear that the Maya collapsed, or that a civilization mysteriously disappeared into the jungle, understand what actually happened. Between roughly the year 750 and the year 900 of the Common Era, over the course of about a century and a half, the great courtly cities of the southern lowlands stopped commissioning monuments, stopped keeping their dynastic records, and were gradually left to the trees. The kings ended. The particular political arrangement ended. The population of that specific zone dropped enormously as people moved, and moved again, mostly north and toward the coasts and the highlands, following water and opportunity the way people always have. But the people themselves did not evaporate. They walked. They carried their languages with them, and their calendar, and their maize, and their names for the days, and they are still carrying them. That is the promise of tonight, made right at the start so you can rest easy the whole way through. This is not the story of a people who ended. It is the story of a people who changed address several times over 3,000 years and are still here, and can tell you so themselves in a language older than English. Before we walk the long road slowly, let me lay the whole map out on the table, so that you always know roughly where you are, even if you are only half awake. Think of it as looking at the shape of a mountain range from a distance before you go walking in it. There are, by the usual reckoning, 5 great stretches of time in this story. The first is the archaic, the deep beginning, running from perhaps 8,000 years before the Common Era down to about 2,000 years before it. This is the age of the wild grass and the small band, and the first slow domestication of a plant that would come to organize every single thing that followed. Nothing is written. Nothing is built. Everything that matters is being invented in kitchens and gardens. The second stretch is the pre-classic, sometimes called the formative, running from about 2,000 years before the Common Era to around the year 250 of the Common Era. This is far longer than most people imagine, more than 2,000 years, and it is where the surprises live. In this period, the Maya invent villages, then towns, then, astonishingly early, enormous cities. It is here that a place in the northern Petén called El Mirador raises a platform so vast that it is still, by sheer volume of material moved, among the largest structures ever built by human hands anywhere on Earth. It is here that writing appears, and the calendar and kingship, and the entire visual language of masks and stucco and stacked platforms that the later cities would inherit. And it is here, near the end, that the first great abandonment happens, centuries before the famous one, when El Mirador and its neighbours are left to the trees. That first quiet ending is a rehearsal for the later one, and hardly anyone talks about it. The third stretch is the classic, from about the year 250 to about the year 900. This is the period that fills the museums and the postcards. Carved stone monuments with dates on them, some 60 or 70 known kingdoms, a shifting board of alliances and rivalries dominated for centuries by two enormous rival powers. Tikal in the middle of the Piton and Calakmul to the north, each with client cities and marriage networks and long memories. It is the age of the painted tomb and the corbelled vault and the ball court and the hieroglyphic stairway. It is also, and this genuinely matters, the age in which the Maya wrote their own history down in their own words. Which means that for a window of about 600 years, we can hear them speak about themselves, in their own names, on their own terms. That is a rare gift from the ancient world. The fourth stretch is the post-classic, from about the year 900 to the arrival of Europeans in the early 1500s. The southern courts have gone quiet. The centre of gravity has moved north and to the coasts. Chichen Itza rises into something new and cosmopolitan and hard to categorise, trading up and down the whole seaboard, and later Mayapan gathers the noble families of the north behind a single wall in an arrangement that is half federation and half hostage situation. Merchants in long canoes work the coast in numbers that astonish the first Europeans who see them. This is not a decline, it is a different shape. And the fifth stretch is everything since, the colonial centuries and the modern ones. The conquest that took nearly 200 years to finish, because the last independent Maya kingdom held out on an island in a lake until the very end of the 1600s. The burning of the books, the survival of the languages, the rebellions, the plantations, the 20th century with all its cruelty and all its recovery, and the millions of Maya people living now. 5 stretches: archaic, pre-classic, classic, post-classic, and living. Keep that skeleton, and every detail we add tonight will have somewhere to hang. And now, since I promised you the payoff at the front and not at the back, let me give you the whole answer to the question that brought most people to this story in the first place. What happened to them? Here is the honest, current, unromantic answer, and it will take about 4 minutes, and then we will spend the rest of the night earning it properly. Around the middle of the 8th century of the Common Era, the southern lowlands were at the absolute top of their arc. The population of the central Piton and its surroundings was enormous. Recent aerial surveys using laser scanning, which strips away the forest canopy and shows the ground beneath, found more than 60,000 previously unknown structures in a single region of northern Guatemala, along with causeways, terraces, reservoirs and defensive works nobody suspected. The old estimates of a few 100,000 people scattered thinly among ceremonial centres were simply wrong. The landscape was full. Perhaps 7 million people, perhaps more, lived in the central lowlands at the peak, farming almost every workable hectare, terracing hillsides, draining swamps into raised fields, managing forest gardens of fruit and nut trees, and feeding cities of tens of thousands. It was a landscape as engineered as medieval Europe, and it was doing well. And then, over roughly the next 150 years, it came apart. Not all at once, and not everywhere at the same time. The dates on the monuments tell the story with terrible clarity, because the Maya dated things so precisely. In the year 790, 19 different kingdoms erected dated monuments. 40 years later, only 12 did. By the year 860, 3, the last securely dated classic monument anywhere in the southern lowlands, was carved at a small city called Tunina and corresponds to the year 909 of the Common Era, and after that the stone record simply stops, like a conversation ending mid-sentence in another room. Why? Not one reason. Several reasons braided together, which is how large things usually fall. The clearest single thread is drought. Sediment cores drilled from the bed of a lake in the northern Yucatan, and mineral layers grown drop by drop inside caves in Belize, both preserve a record of rainfall going back thousands of years, and both show the same thing. Between roughly the year 800 and the year 1000, the region went through the driest stretch in several thousand years, with a handful of severe multi-year droughts stacked inside it. In a landscape with no rivers in the north and a total dependence on stored rainwater in the south, that is not an inconvenience. That is the floor moving. The second thread is that the system had almost no slack left in it. When you have filled the land, cleared much of the forest for fuel and for the lime plaster that coated every building, exhausted soils on the steeper ground, and built your food supply around one crop that fails in the same year for everybody at once, a bad decade is not survivable in the way that it would have been 3 centuries earlier when there were half as many people and twice as many trees. The third thread is war. The 8th century sees fortifications going up around cities that had never needed walls, and monuments that record defeats rather than victories, and a general sharpening of what had been a competitive but manageable political game. The fourth thread, and perhaps the deepest, is that Maya kingship made a specific promise. The king was the one who fed the rain, who bled for the maize, whose body and whose rituals kept the world turning. If the rain fails once, that is a test. If it fails for 30 years, the promise is broken, and what breaks with it is not just a harvest, but the entire reason for holding still and paying tribute and hauling stone for a court that is visibly failing to deliver. And so people did the most reasonable thing in the world. They left, not in a single night, not in a panic, but the way people leave any place that has stopped working. One family and then a neighbourhood and then a district at a time, over decades, walking north where there was still water in the cenotes, or east to the coast where there was trade and salt and fish, or south into the highlands where their cousins were, or simply out into the countryside to live in smaller, quieter, more resilient villages that left no monuments and therefore, for a long time, left no trace that archaeologists knew how to see. The courts stopped, the dynasties ended, the plazas were not swept. Lime plaster cracked, and seeds fell into the cracks, and roots followed the seeds, and within a couple of centuries a city that had held 40,000 people was a set of green hills with a howler monkey sitting on top of the tallest one. That is the collapse. It is a real thing, and it was very hard on the people who lived through it, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But notice what it is not. It is not a mystery. It is not sudden. It is not total. Because the northern cities were expanding at precisely the moment the southern ones were emptying, and Chichen Itza reached its height in the very century the last southern monuments were being carved. And above all, it is not the end, because the people who walked out of the Piton in the 9th century are the ancestors of people who are alive right now. Everything else we say tonight is detail on that frame. The rest of this recording is the long, gentle, patient version, with the names in it, and the pots, and the beekeeping, and the queen who ruled a city for half a century, and the boy king who put his father in a stone box under a pyramid and built a staircase down to him, and the 2 scholars on opposite sides of a cold war who cracked the writing without ever being allowed to properly talk to each other. So there is nothing left to worry about. The question has been answered. You can let go of it now and simply listen to the story for its own sake, which is the best reason to listen to any story, and by far the best way to fall asleep. Let us go back then, all the way back, further than the cities, further than the writing, to a highland valley and a woman looking at a plant. 9,000 years ago, in the warm, dry valleys of southern Mexico, in the country that is now called Oaxaca, and along the Balsas River to the west of it, there grew a grass. It was not impressive. If you walked past it, you would not turn around. It stood about waist high, it branched at the base like a small bush, and it carried on its stems a handful of tiny spikes, each spike holding perhaps 6 or 8 seeds in a single row, and each seed locked inside a shell so hard that you could crack a tooth on it. The plant is called teosinte, and its name in the old languages of the region means something close to grain of the gods, which is a very generous thing to call a plant that will not feed you. Nobody looking at teosinte would have predicted anything. And yet every tortilla on every table in the Americas tonight, every ear of sweet corn, every bowl of grits and every kernel of popcorn and every drop of the syrup in a cold drink descends from that unremarkable grass because a very long line of people, most of them almost certainly women, spent thousands of years paying attention to it. Here is how it happened, as best we can reconstruct it, and it is one of the great slow miracles of human history. Each season a family harvested teosinte. Some plants had slightly more seeds than others, some had seeds with slightly softer shells. Some held their seeds on the stalk instead of shattering and scattering them on the ground the moment they ripened, which is a disaster for the plant and a gift for the person with the basket. Whoever gathered that grain saved seed from the plants that behaved best, because of course they did, because that is what any sensible person does, and they planted that seed next year near the house where they could water it. Multiply that small sensible act by 400 generations. Somewhere around 6,000 years before the Common Era, the changes begin to show in the archaeological record. By 5,000 years before the Common Era there, a cob's the length of your thumb with 2 neat rows of soft seeds. By 2,500 years before the Common Era there, a cob's as long as your hand. By the time the Maya cities rise, there is maize essentially as we know it, with hundreds of local varieties bred for different soils and altitudes and rains, black and red and white and yellow and blue. No animal did this. No accident did this. Human attention did this, without any theory of genetics, without writing it down, purely by the habit of noticing and keeping and planting again. And then there is the second invention, which is arguably even cleverer, because maize on its own is a trap. Maize is generous with calories and stingy with everything else. Its niacin, the vitamin we call B3, is chemically bound up in a form the human gut cannot open. A population that eats maize as its staple and does nothing else will, over a few generations, begin to suffer terribly from the deficiency disease called pellagra, which brings rough scaling skin, digestive collapse, and a slow dimming of the mind. Europe learnt this the hard way in the 1700s and 1800s after maize crossed the Atlantic without its instructions, and hundreds of thousands of people in Italy and Spain and the American South became ill and died of a disease that the people who bred the plant had solved thousands of years earlier. The solution is called nixtamalization, from the Nahuatl words for ash and dough, and it goes like this. You take your dry maize kernels and you boil them in water with wood ash, or with lime made by burning limestone, which the Maya had in unlimited quantity underfoot. You let them steep overnight. In the morning the skins slip off, the kernels are soft and swollen, and smell faintly of the sea, and something invisible has happened inside them. The alkali has broken the bond holding the niacin captive, so the body can now reach it. It has also increased the available calcium enormously from the lime itself, which matters immensely for a people with no dairy animals. It has improved the protein balance. And, as a bonus that any cook will appreciate, it has made the dough sticky enough to hold together, which is why a tortilla exists at all, and a cake of plain ground maize does not. Grind that soft wet maize on a stone, pat it flat between your palms, cook it on a clay griddle over a small fire, and you have the food that fed a civilization, invented by trial and error and passed hand to hand and mother to daughter for 4,000 years before anyone could explain a single word of the chemistry. Around this plant, everything else assembled itself. Beans came in beside the maize, climbing the stalks, fixing nitrogen back into the soil and completing the protein the maize could not supply on its own. Squash spread across the ground between them, its broad leaves shading out weeds and holding moisture in the earth. 3 plants that grow better together than apart, planted in the same hole, harvested at different times, and between them supplying nearly everything a body needs. The Maya added chili for heat and vitamins, tomatoes, avocados, sweet potato, manioc, and a whole orchard of trees that most people outside the region have never tasted. The sapodilla with its brown sugary flesh, the mamey, the guava, the soursop, the nance, and above all the ramon or breadnut tree, which grows wild in the Piton in astonishing density, produces heavily, and yields a nut that can be dried and stored for years and ground into flour when the maize has failed. Botanists studying the forest around the ruined cities noticed something strange decades ago. The mix of trees is not natural. There is far too much ramon, far too much sapodilla, far too much of everything useful, clustered exactly where people lived. That forest is not wilderness that swallowed a city. That forest is an orchard that outlived its gardeners. Now, with maize in hand, watch the shape of life change. A band that follows game and gathers wild plants must keep moving, and moving means carrying, and carrying means owning almost nothing and having very few children close together. A family with a field must stay. Staying means a house that is worth building properly. It means storage, and storage means surplus. And surplus means that for the first time some people can spend part of the year doing something other than finding food. Staying also means pottery, because clay pots are heavy and fragile and useless to a wanderer and indispensable to a cook with a fixed hearth. The earliest Maya pottery we have found in the lowlands dates to somewhere around 1,000 years before the Common Era, and its arrival is like a light coming on, because pots break and potsherds last forever, and suddenly archaeologists can see where people were and roughly when. The first villages are modest and lovely, a cluster of houses arranged around an open patch of swept earth. The houses themselves have a shape that has not changed in 3,000 years, and you can still see it today along any back road in the Yucatan. A rectangle with rounded ends, walls of poles set upright and lashed and sometimes plastered with mud, a steep roof of palm thatch that sheds a tropical downpour like a duck's back and lasts 20 years, a single doorway, no windows. A beaten earth floor, a hearth of 3 stones, cool in the afternoon, dry in the rain, warm at night, cheap to build, easy to repair, and made entirely of things that grow within a short walk. When we say that the Maya built pyramids, remember that 99 people in 100 lived in this house, and that the pyramid is a version of this house, scaled up and set on a mountain of rubble and plaster, with the same steep roof and the same single door. Around the houses, the compound. A raised platform to keep the floor above the mud. A separate small building for storage. A kitchen area, often outdoors under a shade roof, with the 3 hearthstones and the grinding stone, and above the fire a rack for smoking and drying. A garden of chilies and herbs and fruit trees close enough to defend from animals. A midden, a rubbish heap, which future archaeologists will treasure beyond anything else on the site. And underneath the floor of the house itself, the dead. This is one of the most human details in the whole of Maya life, and it never stops being touching. Ordinary Maya families buried their ancestors beneath the floors of the rooms they lived in, wrapped, with a few small things they had loved, a pot, a shell, a bead of green stone placed in the mouth. Grandmother is under the sleeping bench. Great-grandfather is under the doorway. The family is not a thing that ends when someone stops breathing. The house holds everyone who has ever belonged to it, and every night the living lie down on top of the dead, and nobody finds this frightening, because why would you be frightened of your own grandmother? When a house was rebuilt, and houses were rebuilt often, the new floor went straight over the old one, and the family stayed exactly where it was, layer upon layer, sometimes for centuries. Whole villages sit on top of themselves like that, and when an archaeologist cuts down through the floors, it is like reading the rings of a tree, one generation of ash and shell and small green beads at a time. Villages become towns slowly, and then all at once. By about 1,000 years before the Common Era, the lowland Maya are farming settled land in real numbers, and by 800 years before the Common Era, something new appears in the northern Piton, in a low seasonal swamp basin of very rich soil, at a place we now call Nakbi. Somebody there decided to move a hill. The platforms at Nakbi are not house mounds. They are deliberate architecture on a civic scale, faced with cut stone, coated in brilliant white lime plaster, and carrying on their fronts enormous modelled masks, 3 and 4 meters tall, of a face with square eyes and a downturned mouth and ornaments hanging from its ears. That face will be carried on the front of Maya buildings for the next 1800 years. Nakbi's tallest structure rises about 45 meters, which is roughly a 15-story building, and it was built at a time when, in the usual telling of world history, the Maya had not started yet. To the west, along the Gulf Coast, their neighbours the Olmec were doing something similar and slightly earlier, carving colossal heads out of basalt hauled from mountains 80 kilometres away, and it was long fashionable to say that the Olmec were the mother culture and the Maya the dutiful children. That is no longer how it looks. What it looks like now is a conversation, a shared neighbourhood of societies trading goods and ideas and gods across a few hundred kilometres, each borrowing and adapting, with the Maya contributing at least as much as they received, and each ending up with something recognisably its own. The most consequential thing to come out of that conversation, or possibly to be invented independently within it, is the idea that a person can be a king. Not simply a respected elder, not a war leader for the season, but a permanent, hereditary, sacred office, occupied by one man or occasionally one woman who stands at the exact centre of the world and holds it open. In Maya, the title is Ajor, and later Kuhul Ajor, Holy Lord. The Ajor is not merely a ruler, he is the axis. When he bleeds, the world is fed. When he dances in the mask of a god, the god is present. When he dies, his body goes into the mountain and the mountain becomes his house, and his son climbs the stairs on the outside of it to speak to him. Everything the Maya built, all the height and the plaster and the stairways and the carved portraits, exists to make that one claim visible from a great distance. And nowhere was it made more emphatically than at El Mirador. 60-odd kilometres from anywhere, deep in the swamp forest of the far northern Petén, close to the modern border between Guatemala and Mexico. El Mirador flourished from roughly 300 years before the Common Era to about the year 150 of the Common Era. At its height, it may have held 100,000 people or more in the city and its surrounding settlements. It sprawls across some 16 square kilometres of dense construction. And at its eastern edge stands La Danta. La Danta is a triadic complex, meaning a large platform carrying 3 temples arranged around a summit court, which was the classic pre-classic arrangement. And it sits on top of a natural rise which the builders enlarged and cased and plastered until nature and architecture became one object. From the forest floor to the top of the highest temple is about 70 metres, roughly a 23-storey building. But height is not the striking number. Volume is. The best estimates put something in the region of 2.5 to 3 million cubic metres of stone and fill in the La Danta complex, which by pure quantity of material moved places it among the very largest single constructions ever raised anywhere on Earth, exceeding by volume the most famous pyramids of the Old World, though not their height or their precision. It was built with no metal tools, no pulleys, no draft animals, and no wheeled vehicles. It was built with stone hammers, wooden levers, fibre rope, woven baskets, and an enormous quantity of patiently organised human labour. Hauling fill up a ramp in loads that a person could carry on their back with a strap across the forehead, and every square metre of the outside was finished in lime plaster, blazing white, sometimes painted deep red, so that the whole thing stood above the green like a mountain made of cloud. Between El Mirador and its neighbouring cities, Nakbe and Tintal and Huacna and dozens more, the builders laid roads. The Maya word is Sacbe, white road, plural Sacbeob, and they are one of the most underappreciated achievements of the ancient Americas. A sacbe is a causeway, raised above the swamp on a bed of rough stone, levelled with gravel, surfaced with white lime plaster, sometimes 20 or even 40 metres wide, running dead straight across the landscape for kilometres. Laser survey has now traced more than 170 kilometres of causeway in the Mirador Basin alone, binding perhaps 24 settlements into a single connected system. Nobody had carts. Nobody had horses. These roads carried people on foot and cargo on backs, and their width says clearly that they were also processional, ceremonial, a statement in plaster that these places belonged to one another. Standing on one at night in the dry season, with the moon up, the surface would have glowed pale enough to walk without a torch, a white ribbon laid across black forest. And then, having built all of that, El Mirador was abandoned. Not conquered, as far as anyone can tell, not burned, simply, over the course of the 2nd century of the Common Era and a little after, left, the population declined, the great courts stopped being maintained, the plaster cracked, and the forest did what forests do. This is the first collapse, 600 or 700 years before the famous one, and it is a useful rehearsal because the suspects are the same. Sediment cores from the basin show serious drought in exactly that window. They also show something quieter and more damning. The lime plaster that made those cities beautiful was made by burning limestone, and burning limestone takes an immense amount of wood. Estimates suggest that producing a single square metre of the plaster used at that scale might consume the equivalent of a substantial tree, and El Mirador plastered everything and replastered it every few decades. Around the city, the pollen record shows the forest giving way to grasses and weeds. With the trees gone from the slopes, rain washed the soil off the high ground and dumped it into the Bajos below. And the Bajos, which had been shallow permanent wetlands that could be farmed and fished, filled with clay and became seasonal mud. The city ate its own foundation, slowly, over 3 centuries, with the best of intentions, one beautiful white building at a time. It is worth pausing on that, gently, because it is the sort of thing that is easy to turn into a lecture and does not deserve to be one. Nobody at El Mirador was foolish. Every individual decision was reasonable. Burn some limestone, make the temple bright, honour the ancestors, employ the neighbours, do what your grandfather did. The failure was not in any decision, but in the sum of 10,000 of them across 300 years, which is a length of time no human being can feel. And the people, once again, did not die out. They walked. Many of them went south and east, into the central Piton, to a set of smaller settlements clustered around lakes and high ground, places with names that were nothing much yet, and one of those places was a modest town with good water and a defensible ridge, sitting between 2 swamps, which had been quietly growing for a few hundred years already, and which was about to spend the next 8 centuries as the most consequential city in the Maya world. Its ancient name was Yaxmutul. We call it Tikal. Before we follow them there, though, we need to give the Maya the 2 tools that make everything afterward legible, and that make this civilization different in kind from most of its neighbours. We need to give them writing, and we need to give them the calendar. Both were already forming at Nakbé and El Mirador, painted on walls and scratched on stone. Both would be brought to a level of sophistication that took the rest of the world by surprise when it was finally understood. And both are, in their way, deeply restful things to think about at night, because they are systems built by people who believed absolutely that time was not a river running away from them, but a wheel that would come around again, and that everything which has happened will, in its proper season, happen once more. Of all the writing systems that human beings have invented from scratch, and there are only a handful of true independent inventions in the whole history of the world, the Maya script is one of the loveliest to look at and one of the most stubbornly misunderstood. For the better part of a century, learned people insisted it was not really writing at all. It was too pretty, they said, too pictorial, too crowded with faces and animals and hands. It must be a system of symbols, a set of pictures standing for ideas, capable of recording dates and gods and little else. That opinion was wrong in every particular. Maya writing is a full script. It can write any sentence that can be spoken in the Mayan languages, with grammar, with verb tenses, with poetry, with jokes, with the names of ordinary people, with the phrase "this is the drinking vessel of so-and-so" for cacao. painted around the rim of a cup so that the owner's name went round and round while he drank. Here is how it works, and it is worth understanding even half awake, because the elegance of it is soothing. A Maya text is written in blocks, and each block is roughly one word or one phrase. Inside the block, the individual signs are packed together like luggage in a small car, resized and rotated and tucked into each other's corners to fill the square neatly, which is precisely why it looked to outsiders like decoration rather than language. Reading order is a gentle zigzag, in paired columns, left then right, then down a row, left then right, then down again. Two kinds of sign do the work. Some are logograms, whole words in one image. A jaguar head reads Balam, jaguar. A shield reads Bakal, and some are syllables, about 100 of them, each standing for a consonant and a vowel, ba, ka, la, mo, tsi, and so on, which can be strung together to spell out anything at all. The scribes moved between the two freely, and delighted in it. You could write the word for jaguar with the picture of the jaguar, or spell it out Balama, or write the picture and then add the little syllable ma underneath as a hint to the reader, the way we might write a difficult name and then put its pronunciation in brackets. That flexibility, that showing off, is exactly what a mature literary tradition looks like. And it is also, incidentally, what made the script so hard for us to crack, because the same sentence could be written 5 different ways by 5 different scribes, all of them correct. Scribes were high-status people. Some were younger sons of royal families. They signed their work, which is rare in the ancient world, and on painted pots you sometimes find a phrase meaning it was his writing, followed by a name, and occasionally a title that translates roughly as the person who is skilled with the brush. Their patron was a pair of monkey gods, which tells you something warm about how they saw themselves. They wrote on stone monuments called stelae, tall carved slabs set upright in plazas with a round altar in front. They wrote on lintels above doorways, on stairways, on the walls of tombs, on bone, on shell, on jade, on the backs of mirrors, and on the sides of every good pot in every noble household. And above all they wrote in books. Maya books were made of the inner bark of the wild fig tree, beaten and layered and pasted into a long strip, coated with fine white lime plaster to give a smooth writing surface, and then folded like a concertina so that the whole thing opened out into a continuous panel and closed into a neat block with wooden covers, sometimes covered in jaguar skin. There were, at a conservative guess, thousands of these, libraries of them. Histories, prophecies, astronomical tables, land records, medicine, songs, genealogies, 4 survive. 4. We will come to how that happened later tonight, and it is the one part of this story where the voice has to work not to be angry. Now the calendar, which is the other half of the Maya mind and in some ways the greater achievement. Understand first that the Maya did not have one calendar. They had several, running at the same time, interlocking, each measuring something different, and a trained daykeeper held all of them in his head at once. The first is the sacred round, the Tzolkin, and it counts 260 days. It is built from 2 wheels turning against each other, a cycle of 13 numbers and a cycle of 20 named days, Imix, Ik, Akbal, Khan, Chitshon, and on through the list. Number 1 pairs with the first day name, number 2 with the second, and when the numbers run out at 13 they start again while the names carry on, so that every possible pairing occurs exactly once before the whole thing returns to its start, 260 days later. Why 260? Nobody is certain, and the honest answer is probably that it is several things at once. It is close to the length of a human pregnancy from a missed period to a birth. In the latitudes where it was invented, it is close to the interval between the 2 days each year when the sun stands exactly overhead at noon. It is 13 times 20, and 20 is the number of fingers and toes, the number of a complete person, and 13 is the number of layers in the sky. Every Maya child was named for the day they were born, and that day had a character, a grain, a set of tendencies, and a person carried it the way we might carry a birth sign, except with far more weight. Ask a Highland Day keeper today what day it is, and he will tell you, because that count of 260 days has run unbroken in parts of Guatemala for well over 2,000 years, through conquest, through burning, through everything, and it did not miss a day. The second calendar is the Harb, the vague year, which counts 365 days in 18 months of 20 days each, plus a short awkward stub of 5 days at the end called Wayeb, which was considered a dangerous, unlucky, in-between time when the boundary between worlds went thin. During Wayeb, people avoided important business, kept the fire low, and waited politely for the year to sort itself out. The Maya knew perfectly well that the true solar year is about a quarter of a day longer than 365, and they never inserted a leap day, because their purpose was not to keep the calendar pinned to the seasons, but to count days exactly, and adding a fictitious day would have broken the count. They simply tracked the drift and adjusted their observations, which is arguably the more honest solution. Run the sacred round and the vague year together, and they lock into a cycle of 52 years, a little over 18,900 days, before the same pairing of Tzolk'in Day and heart position comes round again. That is the calendar round, and 52 years is about a lifetime, which meant that most people lived through the return of their own birthday in the fullest possible sense exactly once, and it was a very great occasion when they did. And then there is the third system, the one that makes the Maya unique among all the peoples of the ancient Americas, and it is called the long count. The calendar round is a wheel. Wheels are wonderful, but a wheel cannot tell you which turn you are on. If your grandfather says a thing happened on 8 Ahau 13 Pop, that is a precise date within any 52-year window and completely ambiguous beyond it. So the Maya, or their neighbours, built a linear counter as well, a simple running tally of days elapsed since a fixed starting point in the deep past. Written in place values. The units are days, then periods of 20 days, then periods of 360 days, which is close enough to a year to be useful, then 20 of those, and then 20 of those again, giving a great cycle of about 5,125 years. Their 0 point, the day from which everything counts, corresponds in our calendar to a day in August, in the year 3114 before the Common Era, which is long before there were any Maya to see it. It is mythological, the day the current world was set in order, and from that point they counted forward, day by day, without a gap, for well over 1,000 years of recorded history. To do that arithmetic they needed a proper number system, and they had one, and it is beautiful in its simplicity. A dot is 1. A bar is 5, so 4 is 4 dots, 7 is a bar and 2 dots, 19 is 3 bars and 4 dots. 20 is where it gets clever, because they used place value, stacking positions vertically, each worth 20 times the one below. And to hold an empty place they used a sign that looks like a shell, and that sign is a 0. Not merely a blank space, but a written symbol for nothing, functioning as a number. In use in the Americas by at least the first centuries of the Common Era, and possibly earlier, at a time when most of the world's mathematics had no such thing, and would not have one for many centuries. With bars, dots and a shell, a scribe could write any number at all and add and subtract with ease, and the astronomical tables in the surviving books contain calculations running into the millions of days, 1,600 years and more, worked out correctly. What did they do with all that arithmetic? They watched the sky, patiently, for a very long time. The most beautiful surviving example is the Venus table in the book we call the Dresden Codex, which tracks the cycle of that planet, its appearance as morning star, its disappearance behind the sun, its return as evening star, and gives its period as 584 days. The true average is 583.92. Their table includes correction factors to be applied at intervals, so that the whole system stays accurate over 4 centuries, drifting by only a couple of hours across that span. They tracked the moon well enough to predict eclipses, and the eclipse tables in the same book run for 33 years of possible events. They aligned buildings to the rising point of Venus and to the sun at the solstices and equinoxes. And they did all of this with no lenses, no clocks, and no instruments beyond a pair of crossed sticks to fix a sight line, a horizon, and generation after generation of people willing to sit up all night and write down exactly what they saw. So now we come to the classic period, and to Tikal, and to the moment when the Maya begin to tell us their own history in their own voice. Tikal sits on a low limestone ridge in the middle of the Piton, with swamp on either side and no river anywhere near it. That last fact is astonishing when you see the size of the place. There is no water at Tikal except what falls out of the sky, and so the entire city was designed as a rain catchment. The great plazas were paved and plastered and gently sloped, and every drop that fell on them ran into channels and from the channels into reservoirs cut into the bedrock and sealed with clay, and the largest of those reservoirs held something in the order of 75 million litres. Recent work has found that the water in at least one of them was filtered through beds of quartz sand and a volcanic mineral called zeolite, brought in from a source many kilometres away, which absorbs contaminants and clears the water. That is a municipal water treatment system in the rainforest more than 1,000 years before anyone in Europe thought of such a thing. Tikal at its height covered perhaps 60 square kilometres of continuous settlement and held somewhere between 45,000 and 60,000 people in the urban core, with a great many more in the countryside around it. Its temples rose above the canopy in a way that has become the visual shorthand for the entire civilization, and its written history begins, as best we can read it, with a founder named Yax Ep Suk, sometime in the 1st century of the Common Era, and runs through 33 named rulers, generation after generation, each of whom the later kings carefully numbered so that a monument might say that a certain lord was the 26th successor in the line, which is precisely the kind of dynastic bookkeeping that scholars once insisted the Maya did not do. For a few hundred years Tikal grew steadily and quarrelled politely with its nearest large neighbour, a city called Uaxactun, only about 20 kilometres to the north. And then something happened that changed the entire region, and we can date it to the day. On a day corresponding to the 16th of January in the year 378 of the Common Era, a person arrived at Tikal. The monuments call him Siaj Kak, which translates as fire is born. He is described as arriving, a specific verb, from the west. On that exact same day, the reigning king of Tikal, whose name was Shaktok Ishak the First, a name meaning great burning claw, died. The texts use a phrase that is usually understood to mean he entered the water, a formal way of saying he died, and the coincidence of dates is not a coincidence at all. Within a year, a new king sat on the mat at Tikal. He was a boy called Yax Nu Nahin, and his father, according to the monuments, was a foreign lord named Spearthrower Owl, who is never shown as king of Tikal or of any Maya city, and who ruled somewhere else entirely for a very long reign. Where did they come from? Almost certainly from Tehuacan, the vast cosmopolitan metropolis in the highlands of central Mexico, 1,000 kilometres to the west, which at that moment was one of the largest cities on the planet, home to well over 100,000 people. With its own colossal pyramids, its own gridded avenues, its own apartment compounds housing craftsmen from all over Mesoamerica, and a culture that was not Maya at all, and did not speak a Mayan language. After the arrival, the art of Tikal changes. The new king is shown in a Teotihuacan costume, with a feathered headdress and shell goggles over his eyes and a spear thrower in his hand, which is a weapon and a style of fighting that was not local. Green obsidian from a source in central Mexico turns up in the offerings. Pottery in the central Mexican style appears in elite tombs. Whether this was an invasion, a coup backed by foreign soldiers, a diplomatic marriage that happened to arrive with an army, or something more complicated that our categories do not fit. Historians still argue, and the arguing is good-natured and unresolved. What is certain is that it worked. Tikal, with its new foreign connection, its new weapons and its new prestige, promptly conquered Uaxektoon and then spread its influence across the whole central lowlands, installing allies, marrying daughters outward, and becoming for the next 2 centuries the single most powerful court in the Maya world. And here is the detail that always makes this story feel close rather than distant. Almost 50 years later, in the year 426, a man walked several hundred kilometers to the southeast, to the far edge of the Maya world, into a fertile green river valley in what is now western Honduras, and founded a dynasty there. His name, in the writing, is Yaxcucmo, first Quetzalmacao. The monuments of the city he founded, Copan, say that he came from the west, that he took the emblems of kingship at a distant place, and that he arrived after a journey of 153 days. 16 kings of Copan would descend from him, and every single one of them, for 400 years, put his portrait on their monuments as the source of their right to rule. And then, in the 1990s, archaeologists tunneling under the Acropolis at Copan found his tomb, and the tomb of a woman buried nearby who is almost certainly his wife. Chemical analysis of the strontium and oxygen in his teeth, which lock in the signature of the water a person drank in childhood, showed that he did not grow up in Copan. He grew up somewhere in the central Petén, in the region of Tikal. The woman beside him grew up locally. His bones showed old healed fractures, including a badly broken forearm of the kind you get from a blow deflected in a fight, and the wear pattern of a man who had spent his life in armour and on the move. The story the monuments told about him for 4 centuries, that he was a foreigner who came from far away and married in and founded a line, turned out on the evidence of his own skeleton to be simply true. That is the shape of the early classic across the whole region. A network. A few great courts and dozens of smaller ones, tied by marriage, by tribute, by shared style, by trade in obsidian and jade and shell and salt and cacao and quetzal feathers, and by a common written language of prestige that a lord in Honduras and a lord in Yucatan could both read. There was never a Maya empire in the sense of a single state with one capital and one law. That is the first thing to unlearn. There were dozens of independent kingdoms, most of them small, a day or two's walk across, each centred on a city with its own dynasty, its own patron gods, its own emblem glyph, which functioned rather like a coat of arms and meant holy lord of such and such a place. They competed constantly, mostly for prestige in captives and tribute rather than for territory. Since taking land you could not hold was not much use when your army walked home after the harvest. And over this crowded, chatty, competitive board, 2 powers rose so far above the rest that the entire classic period can be told as the story of their rivalry. One was Tikal. The other, 100 kilometers north through the swamp, was a city whose ruins are called Calakmul, and whose ancient dynasty called itself Karnal, the Kingdom of the Snake. If you would like a single thread to follow through the next several hours, follow that one. The snake and the centre. 2 courts, roughly the same size, roughly the same wealth, with utterly different strategies. Tikal was a fortress and a hub, holding the middle, projecting power outward from its own strength. The Snake Kings were diplomats and patrons, and their genius was not conquest but sponsorship. They made friends. They married their daughters into small cities in every direction, arranged the accessions of loyal lords, supplied them, backed them, and slowly built a ring of allies all the way round their rival until Tikal was encircled by client kingdoms with snake connections, some of them practically at Tikal's own gates. It took them the better part of a century to close that ring, and when it closed very hard indeed. The blow fell in the year 562 of the Common Era. A monument at a city called Caracol, in the hills of what is now western Belize, records an event using a particular verb that scholars call the Star War, written with a sign showing a star shedding drops over a place name, and Star War events are the most serious kind of military language in the whole script. The place shedding drops is Tikal. Karakul was a substantial city in its own right, with an astonishing amount of hillside terracing around it and a network of causeways binding its suburbs together. But it had not previously been in Tikal's league, and it did not act alone. Behind it stood the Snake Kings. What exactly happened at Tikal that year we cannot see. There is no destruction layer, no burnt city, no evidence of massacre. What there is instead is silence. For 130 years afterward, Tikal carved almost nothing. The dated monuments stop. The great building programs stop. Later kings would call this stretch of time a gap, and modern scholars call it the hiatus, and it is the exact shape of a proud court that has been comprehensively humiliated and forced into a subordinate arrangement it does not wish to write down. Somebody smashed some of the older monuments, and somebody else carefully re-erected the pieces, which is what people do when they are trying to hold on to a memory in bad circumstances. Meanwhile, Karakul grew enormously, and Calakmul, the snake capital, entered its golden age, and the snake strategy went on doing what it did best, which was to find the sore places in a rival's family and press on them. The best example is a city called Dos Pilas in the Pitex Batun region to the southwest, and it is the closest thing the classic Maya have to a novel. In the middle of the 7th century, a young man of the Tikal royal family, a brother or half-brother of the Tikal king, established himself at Dos Pilas as a loyal outpost, using Tikal's own emblem glyph, which is to say flying his family's flag on the frontier. Then Calakmul came south and defeated him, and instead of dying, he changed sides. He kept the Tikal emblem glyph because it was his by birth, and he became a client of the Snake Kings, and for the rest of his life he made war on his own brother's kingdom, and the texts record him standing beside a snake lord while Tikal's king was taken. Two men with the same royal title from the same house on opposite sides of a war, both entirely legitimate. His descendants at Dos Pilas turned into one of the most aggressive small dynasties in the Maya world, and their history is written on a hieroglyphic stairway that describes conquest after conquest in language that is unusually blunt, with phrases about blood pooling and skulls piling that are not typical of Maya restraint. It did not end well for them, and we will come back to that, because their eventual fate is one of the clearest previews of what was coming for everybody. Out of the Dos Pilas line came one of the great figures of the period, and she is a woman. In the year 682, a princess of Dos Pilas travelled to the city of Niranjo, which had recently been defeated and left without a functioning royal line, and she arrived carrying the authority to restart it. We call her Lady Six Sky. She never took the title of king in her own right on the surviving monuments, but she is shown on stelae doing everything a king does, standing on a bound captive, scattering incense, performing the period-ending rituals that only a ruler may perform, and she did it for decades. Her son became king as a small child, 5 years old, and she governed in his name and beside him for the rest of her life, and during those years, Niranjo went from a wreck to a power, defeating its neighbours in a rapid series of campaigns recorded on her monuments. She died around the year 741, having effectively ruled a kingdom for close to half a century, and her portraits are among the most commanding images any Maya sculptor produced. She is not unique either. There were queens at Palenque, at Yaxchilan, at Koba, at Calakmul itself. The Maya preferred male rulers and said so, but preference is not prohibition. And when a dynasty had no suitable son, or when a woman was simply the strongest available claim, the mat was hers. And presiding over the whole of that century, from the snake capital, was the man the modern literature has nicknamed Yuknum the Great, who took the throne in the year 636 and held it for 50 years. Under him, Calakmul reached the top of the Maya world. Its influence can be traced in the texts of at least a dozen other kingdoms across a region several hundred kilometers wide, from the Usumacinta River in the west to Karakol in the east. He installed kings. He attended their accession ceremonies in person, or sent his lords to attend. He supervised. The verb the texts use for this is beautifully specific and means something like it was overseen by, and it appears again and again with his name attached, on monuments in cities he never ruled directly. Calakmul itself became enormous, with more carved monuments than any other Maya site, well over 100 stelae, though tragically most of them were cut from a soft local limestone that has weathered almost smooth, so that this greatest of Maya capitals has left us the least legible record of any. The city sits today in the middle of an immense biosphere reserve, and to reach it you drive 60 kilometers down a single road through unbroken forest, and then climb a pyramid and look out over an ocean of green with nothing built in it in any direction. It is one of the quietest places on Earth. This whole century of superpower rivalry raises the question of what Maya war actually was, and the answer is not what the older books said, and not quite what the newer, bloodier books said either. It was not the constant total warfare of a state trying to erase its neighbours. Armies were seasonal, raised from farmers between planting and harvest, led by nobles, and they walked. Everything walked. There were no horses, no wheels, and no way to supply a large force in the field for long, which put a hard natural limit on how far and how long anyone could campaign. The weapons were spears, spear throwers, later the bow, wooden clubs edged with blades of obsidian, and shields of wood and hide and cotton padding. The armour was quilted cotton soaked in brine, which sounds unimpressive and was in fact so effective against stone weapons that Spanish soldiers later adopted it in preference to their own steel in that climate. The aim of a battle was frequently the taking of captives, particularly high-ranking ones, because a captured lord was worth immeasurably more alive than dead. He could be paraded, displayed, named on a monument, made to kneel at the base of a stela with his arms bound, his name written on his thigh so that everyone would know exactly who he was. Some captives were sacrificed, and the art does not hide it. Others appear to have been kept for years, and a few were sent home to rule as clients. The point was to prove that your patron gods were stronger than his, and to take his prestige into your own house. Cities were rarely destroyed. Populations were rarely displaced. You wanted your neighbour's tribute, his cacao and his cloth and his feathers and his labour, and a burnt field pays no tribute. But over the 8th century, that changed. The Star War events cluster more thickly. The intervals between them shorten. Cities that had stood open for 400 years start throwing up walls, and at Dos Pilas the walls were built in a hurry out of the stones of their own temples, pulled down and stacked into a rough palisade around the palace, with the carved faces of their ancestors turned inward and hidden, which is an image so eloquent it hardly needs explaining. The court fled to a fortified island in a nearby lake. Their kingdom fell apart, and that happened in the 760s, more than a century before anyone would say the collapse began. Let us leave the wars for a while and go west, to the loveliest city the Maya ever built. Palenque stands on a shelf of green hills at the very edge of the Chiapas highlands, where the mountains stop and the coastal plain begins, and behind it the land rises into cloud forest, and in front of it the flat country runs away north toward the Gulf. It rains there constantly. 9 or 10 streams come down off the hills through the site, and the builders did not fight them. They channeled one straight through the middle of the city in a vaulted stone aqueduct, roofed and buried, so that a river runs underneath a plaza where people were dancing. Where they needed pressure, they narrowed the channel deliberately at the end, creating a head of water sufficient to push it uphill into a fountain, which is a working water pressure system engineered around the year 700 in the middle of a rainforest. Palenque's architecture is unlike anywhere else. Where Tikal built thick and steep and heavy, Palenque built thin and light. Their masons worked out how to reduce the mass of the corbelled vault, the Maya arch, which is not a true arch at all, but 2 walls of stones, each stepping slightly further inward until they nearly meet and a capstone bridges the gap. That design is enormously strong and enormously heavy, and it makes for narrow dark rooms. The Palenque builders lightened the vault, opened the walls into wide multiple doorways with slender piers between them, and covered every surface with modelled stucco of the finest quality anyone in the ancient Americas ever achieved. Painted in reds and blues, portraits so exact and so alive that you can see the personality in a face made of lime and sand 1,250 years ago. And on top of the temples they built roof combs, tall open-work crests of stone standing up along the ridge like a headdress, purely to make the building look taller and to carry more sculpture. The city was not, for most of its history, a great power. It was rich and cultured and vulnerable, sitting out on the western frontier, and in the year 599 and again in 611 the Snake Kings came up the river and sacked it, and the second sacking was severe enough that the texts say the gods of the city were thrown down, which is about the worst sentence a Maya court could be made to write about itself. The royal family very nearly ended. And then came a child. He was born in the year 603 of the Common Era, and his name was Kinish Janab Pakal, and everybody who works on this material simply calls him Pakal. His name means shield. He came to the throne at 12 years old in a shattered city with his mother, a formidable woman called Lady Sarkuk, standing beside him and, for the first 3 years, effectively ruling. His claim to the throne came through her through the female line, which was irregular enough that Pakal spent a good deal of his adult life carefully building a case for its legitimacy in stone, comparing his mother to the first mother of the gods and pointing out, quite reasonably, that if a goddess could hold the world then, so could a queen of Palenque. He then reigned for 68 years. 68. He died in the year 683 at the age of 80, having outlived nearly everyone who remembered the disaster he inherited, and in that time he turned a wrecked frontier town into the most beautiful city in the Maya world. He built the palace with its unique 4-story square tower from which the court could watch the sun descend at the winter solstice, straight into the doorway of the temple he had built for his own burial. And that temple is why he is famous. The Temple of the Inscriptions is a 9-level pyramid, 9 being the number of the layers of the underworld, carrying on its summit a building with 3 great panels of text, 617 glyph blocks, one of the longest Maya inscriptions in existence. In 1948, a Mexican archaeologist named Alberto Ruz noticed that the floor slabs inside the summit temple had a line of holes in them, as if they had been lifted with rope, and that one wall continued downward below the floor rather than resting on it. He lifted the slab. Underneath was a stairway, deliberately filled to the roof with rubble. It took him and his workers 4 field seasons, digging through the wet months and the dry to clear it, descending in a long vaulted stair that turned back on itself and went down through the entire body of the pyramid to below the level of the plaza outside. At the bottom, a chamber sealed with a triangular stone slab, and in front of it the remains of several young people, placed there as companions. Behind the slab, in the summer of 1952, a room 5 meters wide with a vaulted ceiling, damp encrusted with limestone, the walls carved with 9 figures of the Lords of the Night, and filling almost the whole space a single sarcophagus of limestone, weighing something like 20 tons, with a carved lid nearly 4 meters long. Inside was Pakal. Jade covered his body. A mosaic mask of jade and shell and obsidian over his face, jade rings on every finger, a jade bead in his mouth, a jade belt, and beside him the bones of a life that had lasted 80 years. Running from the tomb up the entire stairway to the temple above was a narrow tube of stone, moulded like a hollow snake, deliberately built into the fabric of the pyramid so that, as the archaeologists put it, the dead king would not be entirely cut off from the living, and the offerings and the words spoken above could travel down to him. The lid of that sarcophagus is one of the great works of art of the ancient world, and it is worth describing slowly, because it is also one of the most misrepresented. It shows Pakal at the moment of his death, falling backward into the open jaws of the underworld, which are shown as a great skeletal maw at the bottom of the image. Rising out of his body, up the centre of the composition, is the world tree, the Chiba, with branches ending in serpent heads, and at its top the celestial bird with wings spread. Around the whole border runs a band of sky signs, the sun, the moon, Venus, the stars, and the names and dates of his ancestors. It is a picture of a man dying and, in the same instant, becoming the axis of the world, going down into the earth like a seed and rising as a tree. In the 1960s, a writer looked at this image, turned it on its side, decided it looked like a man in a rocket, and launched a small industry of nonsense that persists to this day. It says something about the 20th century that, faced with the tomb of an 80-year-old king, buried under his own inscriptions in a pyramid he had designed, with his name and his birth date and his death date written all around him, in a script that has now been read, some people preferred a spaceship. The Maya wrote their own explanation on the box. His son, Kinich Khan Barlam, took the throne and built the group of 3 temples on the far side of the plaza, the Cross Group, each of which holds an inscribed panel telling the story of the creation of the world and the birth of the patron gods of Palenque. And then, without a break in the text, continuing straight on into the birth and accession of the family, so that the reigning dynasty is joined to the beginning of time in one unbroken sentence. That is what Maya kingship was for, expressed as literature. And then, within about 130 years of Pakhal's death, Palenque stopped. The last dated monument there falls around the year 799. There is no destruction, no burning, no sign of catastrophe. Just an end of carving, a thinning of the pottery, and then a very long quiet, while the streams the engineers had tamed came back up through the plaster and the forest closed over the tower. Now travel southeast to the far corner of the Maya world, where the rainforest gives way to pine-covered mountains and a broad green river valley with unusually good soil. This is Copan, in what is now western Honduras, and it is the most artistically ambitious city the Maya ever made. The local stone is a volcanic tuff, softer than limestone and finer grained, and it takes a chisel the way butter takes a knife. And the sculptors of Copan discovered that they could carve almost in the round. Their monuments are not flat panels with figures in low relief. They are portrait statues, fully 3-dimensional, standing free, wrapped in a fantastic density of ornament, headdresses of masks stacked on masks, sceptres, jade, feathers, so deeply undercut that you can put your hand behind the stone. Nobody else did that. Copan was founded, as we said, by the traveller Yaxcook Mo in the year 426, and it ran for 16 kings across nearly 400 years, and the 13th of them is the one who defines the place. His name reads Waxacla-Jun Ubar Kawil, which is 18 images of the god Kawil, and for years English-speaking archaeologists nicknamed him 18 Rabbit, which stuck, and which is unfair to him because he was one of the great patrons of art in the history of the Americas. He came to the throne in the year 695 and ruled for 43 years. He rebuilt the ball court, which is the most beautiful ball court anywhere, sloping stone benches on either side with sculpted macaw heads projecting from the walls, set in a green amphitheatre with the mountains behind. He filled the plaza with stelae, 7 of them portraits of himself in different divine aspects, each one a small mountain of carved stone. He rebuilt temples over temples, and under his patronage the sculptors of Copan reached a level of confidence that, in the hard judgment of art historians who have looked at everything, is not matched anywhere else in the region. And then, in the year 738, on a day in April, he was captured and beheaded by the king of a small city 25 kilometers down the river. That city is Quirigua. It had been a Copan client for its entire existence, a minor place in a floodplain, with the one significant advantage of sitting astride the Motagua River, which was the trade route for jade coming down from the only source of true jadeite in all of Mesoamerica, in the mountains upstream. Its ruler, a man named Cactiliu Chanyapot, decided that he did not wish to be a client anymore, and there is good circumstantial reason to think that the Snake Kings of Calakmul had a hand in encouraging him. The event is recorded on Quirigua's own monuments with unmistakable satisfaction, and on Copan's monuments with a silence so total that for a while it was hard to be sure what had happened. What Quirigua did next is almost comic in its confidence. Having killed the greatest patron of sculpture in the Maya world, they set about outdoing him. The site is small, its architecture unremarkable, and its plaza contains the tallest carved stone monuments ever raised by the Maya. One of them stands about 10.5 meters from its base, with roughly 3 meters of that buried in the ground, and it weighs in the region of 60 tonnes, quarried from sandstone and dragged and lifted upright by people with rope and timber. It carries a portrait of the man who took 18 rabbit, standing calmly, with a text down the sides recording the deed. Copan, meanwhile, did not fall. It went quiet for a while, and then it did something extraordinary. The 15th king, Kak Yipyaj Chan Kawil, set out to answer the humiliation with history. He commissioned the hieroglyphic stairway, a flight of 62 steps climbing the front of a temple, every riser carved with glyphs, more than 2,200 glyph blocks in all. The longest single Maya text that survives anywhere by an enormous margin. It tells the whole dynastic story from the founder onward, with the seated portraits of 5 kings set at intervals up the middle of the flight, and at the bottom a mosaic of a captive taken in war. It is a monumental argument, in stone, that the line was unbroken and the city was intact. Sadly, the stairway collapsed at some point in antiquity and was found as a jumble, and the early archaeologists reassembled it in the wrong order, so that a text we can now read letter by letter is scrambled beyond reliable reconstruction, like a book whose pages were shuffled before anyone learned the language. The 16th and last king of Copan, Yaxpasaj Chan Yapat, took the throne in the year 763 and did something that tells you a great deal about how a Maya court thought when it was worried. He built an altar, the one archaeologists call Altar Q, a stone block a little over 1.5 meters square, with a bench of 16 seated figures carved around all 4 sides, one for each king of the dynasty in order, each sitting cross-legged on his own name. The sequence begins with the founder handing a scepter across to the last king, so that the line closes into a ring, 400 years and 16 men, sitting in a circle having a meeting. He buried offerings underneath it. Within 40 years, Copan's monument record ends. And in the valley, the archaeology of the last generations tells a hard story. Skeletons from the final decades show more anemia, more childhood malnutrition, more infectious disease, shorter lives. The hillsides had been cleared and farmed too steeply, and the soil had washed down into the valley. The city did not empty overnight, and people kept living in the valley for a century or more after the last king, but the court and the sculptors. And the astonishing 400-year conversation in stone stopped, now north again, to the Usumacinta, the great river of the western lowlands, where 2 cities face each other from a bend and a bluff. Yaxchilan sits inside a horseshoe loop of the river, water on 3 sides, so that the city is nearly an island. Its speciality was the carved lintel, the stone beam over a doorway. Carved on the underside so that you have to stand in the doorway and look up to read it, which means the images were meant for the person entering the room and nobody else. And the lintels of Yaxchilan include the most intimate and most physically startling images in Maya art. In one, a queen we call Lady Exok kneels before her husband, holding a rope set with thorns and drawing it through her own tongue, with a basket of blood-spotted paper in front of her. In the next, she looks up and a great serpent rises out of the smoke of the burning paper, and out of the serpent's mouth leans the figure of an ancestor in war costume, and she is looking directly at him. This was not cruelty, and it was not punishment. Royal bloodletting was the central obligation of Maya rulership, performed by men and women alike, the king from his own body, the queen from her tongue, and the blood was caught on bark paper and burned, and in the smoke the ancestors came. The king fed the world out of himself. That was the deal, and the whole apparatus of temples and plazas and stairways existed to make the fulfillment of it visible. 15 kilometers away, at a small dependency called Bonampak, 3 rooms of a modest building preserve the finest paintings of the ancient Americas. Rainwater carrying dissolved limestone seeped through the vault for 1,200 years and laid a translucent skin of calcite over the walls, sealing them. The murals show a court in the year 790, life-size, in blazing blue and ochre and green, and they show everything. Musicians with trumpets and turtle shell, drums and rattles. Lords in white cloaks, arguing, in conversation, with their hands up. A woman in a doorway. A royal family with a small child held by an attendant. Dancers in enormous headdresses on a stair. A battle in the forest, spears crossing, a man being pulled by the hair. Captives on the steps afterward, bleeding from the fingers, one of them slumped and finished. And on the top stepped the king in a jaguar pelt, calm, looking down. When these paintings were found in 1946, the picture of the peaceful astronomer Maya took its first serious wound, and never recovered. We have spent a long time with kings, because kings wrote things down. Let us spend a while now with everybody else, which is to say with about 99 people in every 100, and let us do it slowly, because this is the most comfortable part of the night. A day in a Maya household began before light. The women were up first, because the maize had to be ground, and grinding maize is the great unspoken labour of the ancient Americas. The kernels had been simmered in lime water the evening before and left to steep overnight, and now they were rinsed and rubbed between the hands to slip the skins off, and then knelt over and pushed back and forth on a flat stone with a stone roller, again and again, until the wet grain became a smooth dough. 3 or 4 hours a day, every day, for a household of any size. Then the dough was patted flat between the palms, a sound you can hear across a village at dawn, a soft rhythmic clapping from every compound at once, and laid on a clay griddle over the 3 hearthstones, and turned, and puffed, and stacked in a cloth to stay warm. With the tortillas there would be beans, cooked slowly in a round-bellied pot pushed into the ashes, and squash, and chili ground with tomato and salt, and on good days a stew of turkey or duck or fish or venison or peccary, and tamales, which are the true ancient food of the region, maize dough wrapped around something delicious and steamed inside a leaf. Tamales appear on painted pots in stacks, being presented at feasts, and they were as much a part of a formal occasion then as a cake is at ours. The men went out to the milpa. A milpa is not simply a field, it is a system, and it is still work today. A patch of forest is selected, its undergrowth cut in the dry season and left to dry, and then burned once. Quickly, releasing a flush of nutrients into the thin tropical soil. Into the ash the farmer walks with a fire-hardened digging stick, punching a hole every metre or so, dropping in a few grains of maize, a bean, a squash seed, and closing it with his heel. The 3 plants come up together and support each other. The field is cropped for a few years, then rested for many, and while it rests it is not abandoned, it is quietly managed, allowed to grow back into useful trees and shrubs, so that what looks to an outsider like wilderness is in fact a fallow orchard that will be cut again in a decade. Beside the milpa there were kitchen gardens, and terraces on the slopes with retaining walls of dry stone, and raised fields in the wetlands built up out of dredged muck between canals, which produced enormous yields, and also fish and turtles in the ditches. The old idea that the Maya could only practice thin shifting agriculture, and therefore could not have had large populations, died with the discovery of those terraces and canals. Tens of thousands of hectares of them, visible now from the air. What they had no domestic animals to speak of. That is the great difference between the Americas and the Old World, and it shaped everything. No cattle, no sheep, no goats, no pigs, no horses, no donkeys. There were dogs, several breeds of them, some kept as companions, some, being honest, kept for the pot. There were turkeys, domesticated from the local wild bird. There were stingless bees, kept in hollow logs stoppered at both ends and stacked in racks under a shelter, tended with real affection and their own patron god, producing a thin dark honey that was the only sweetener anybody had and the base of a ceremonial drink. And that was the list. No milk, no cheese, no wool, no leather at scale, no plough, no cart, and nothing to pull a plough or a cart if you had built one. Every single thing that moved in the Maya world moved because a human being carried it, on their back, with a woven strap across the forehead, or in a canoe. Hold that in mind next time you picture a pyramid. Trade, nevertheless, was constant and long distance and vigorous. Salt came from the great evaporation flats along the north coast of Yucatan, where seawater was let into shallow pans and dried, and from coastal workshops in Belize where brine was boiled in pots over fires. And salt is not a luxury, it is a physiological necessity in a hot climate, and the northern salt beds may have been the single most valuable resource in the entire region. Obsidian came down from the highland volcanoes in prepared cores, and a skilled napper could strike 30 or 40 blades off one core, each sharper than a razor used for everything from surgery to shaving to cutting an umbilical cord. Jade came from the Motagua Valley and nowhere else, and was worked with string and sand and infinite patience, since there was no metal hard enough to cut it. Cacao grew in a few humid pockets, and was worth so much that its beans functioned as currency, countable, portable, and, as one colonial document memorably complains, occasionally counterfeited by filling empty shells with earth. Quetzal feathers, jaguar pelts, spondylus shell from the Pacific, stingray spines for bloodletting, cotton, cochineal red, painted pots, and the polished mirrors of pyrite mosaic in which a lord could see his own face. Markets were large and organised, held on a fixed day, with sections for different goods and officials to settle disputes, and the descriptions written by the first Europeans to see one in Mesoamerica are a long list of astonished nouns. And the goods moved along the coast in canoes. On his fourth voyage, in the year 1502, off the coast of what is now Honduras, an Italian navigator in Spanish service met a trading canoe coming the other way. It was described as being as long as a galley and as wide as a man's outstretched arms, carved from a single trunk, with a palm-roofed shelter amidships to keep the cargo dry, crewed by about 24 paddlers, and carrying women and children and merchandise. Copper axes and bells, obsidian blades set in wooden swords, cotton cloth dyed in many colours, fermented maize beer, and a quantity of small brown almonds which the crew valued so highly that when a few spilled, every man stooped to pick them up as if an eye had fallen out of his head. Those were cacao beans, and that is the first written European description of chocolate, and the encounter was entirely peaceful, and both sides went on their way. Now the people themselves. They were not tall by modern standards, the men averaging around 1.5 metres and a little more, the women a little less, strongly built, with black hair and dark eyes and brown skin. They cared enormously about how they looked. A baby's head was gently and painlessly shaped in the first months of life by binding it between 2 padded boards, producing a long sloping forehead that was considered beautiful and noble and made the head resemble an ear of maize. Adults filed their front teeth into decorative shapes and drilled small round holes in them to inlay discs of jade or pyrite, which required a steady hand and a great deal of trust. They tattooed and scarified, painted themselves with red and black and blue according to occasion and status, wore their hair long and elaborately dressed, and hung as much jade and shell on themselves as their rank permitted. Clothing was cotton, woven at home on a backstrap loom, a device of astonishing simplicity, one end tied to a tree or a post and the other to a strap around the weaver's hips, so that she tensions the warp with her own body and can roll it up and carry it away when the rain comes. The patterns woven in the highlands today, the diamonds and zigzags and rows of small figures, correspond in many cases exactly to the patterns painted on classic period pots, which means those designs have been passed mother to daughter for well over 1,000 years. And in the middle of every substantial city there was a ball court. The ball game is the oldest team sport in the world for which we have physical evidence, going back more than 3,500 years in Mesoamerica. The court is a long alley between 2 sloping walls, often shaped like a capital letter with serifs at each end. The ball was solid rubber made from latex tapped from a tree and cured with the juice of a morning glory vine, which is a genuine feat of chemistry, and it was heavy, 3 or 4 kilograms in some cases, hard enough to break a rib. Players struck it with hip and thigh and forearm, wearing thick padded belts and knee guards, and the aim was to keep it from touching the ground, with points scored by getting it past the opposing side, and in the later northern courts by driving it through a stone ring set vertically high on the wall, which must have happened about as often as anything wonderful does. It was a game, played for fun and for gambling and for civic pride. It was also a reenactment of the story at the centre of Maya religion, in which 2 young men play ball against the lords of death and win. And sometimes, in a particular political circumstance, a captured enemy lord was made to play a version of it that he was not going to survive. All 3 of those things were true at once, and it is a mistake to insist on only one of them. There was music everywhere, and it is easy to forget because none of it survives. The Maya had no stringed instruments at all, and so their sound was made of breath and skin and shell. Long, straight wooden trumpets, painted, played in pairs, flutes and whistles and ocarinas of fired clay, thousands of which survive, many shaped like animals or like little seated people, and many of which still play, so that you can pick up a whistle made 1200 years ago and blow into it and hear precisely the note somebody heard then. Drums with skin heads, drums made of a hollowed log with a slit, and the turtle shell. Struck with a deer antler, which gives a hollow tock that carries a surprising distance, rattles of gourd filled with seed, and strings of shells or dried seed pods tied around the ankles so that a dancer becomes his own percussion section. Trumpet, flute, drum rattle and 100 people singing in a plastered plaza with hard bright surfaces on every side at night by torchlight. Would have been overwhelming, and that was rather the idea. They had doctors too, and their pharmacy was serious. The forest supplied several hundred medicinal plants that are still in use, and modern testing has confirmed genuine activity in a good many of them: antibacterial, antifungal, antiparasitic, anti-inflammatory. Tobacco was medicine before it was anything else, used in strong doses and applied as much as smoked. Wounds were closed with sutures of human hair, and there is evidence of teeth being drilled and filled with mineral cements that bonded so well that they have held for over 1,000 years in a skull. Bone setting was skilled. Sweat baths, small low-domed rooms of stone with a fire pit, were built beside palaces and beside ordinary houses, and served for medicine, for purification, and above all for childbirth and recovery afterward, attended by midwives whose patron was the old moon goddess. And children were adored, in the ordinary way that children are always adored, which the painted pots record without meaning to. A small child on a woman's hip in the corner of a court scene, a toy dog on wheels, and it is worth noticing that the Maya and their neighbours did in fact know about the wheel and made rolling toys with it, and never used it for work, because with no animal on earth strong enough to pull a cart, and a landscape of swamp and forest, a wheel is a charming idea and a wheelbarrow is a nuisance. To understand what the Maya thought the world was, begin with a tree. At the centre of everything stands a ceiba, the great silk cotton tree of the tropical forest, which really does look like the axis of creation when you meet one. A pale grey column going up 30 or 40 metres with almost no branches and then opening into a flat crown above the canopy, with buttress roots at the bottom that stand taller than a person and run out across the ground like the walls of rooms. Its roots go down into the underworld, its trunk stands in the world of people, its branches hold up the sky. At the 4 corners of the world stand 4 more trees, one for each direction, each with its colour: red for the east where the sun comes up, black for the west, white for the north, yellow for the south, and green for the centre, which is why green was the holiest colour and jade the holiest stone. Above the world are 13 layers of sky, and below it 9 layers of underworld, and the sun travels through all of them, rising in the east, crossing the day, dying in the west, and passing at night through the underworld as a jaguar, fighting his way back to the east to be born again in the morning, Everything in the Maya cosmos moves in circles like that. Nothing is ever simply over. The underworld had a name, Xibalba, which means place of fright, and it is worth saying clearly that it was not hell. It was not a punishment for the wicked. It was simply where you went, damp and dark and full of powerful, capricious, rather bureaucratic lords with unpleasant names. And the point was to get through it, not to be spared it. And the story of how that is done is preserved in one of the world's great books, which survived by an accident so narrow it takes the breath away. The book is the Popol Vuh, the council book, the sacred history of the Quiché Maya of the Guatemalan highlands. Its content is ancient. Scenes from it are painted on classic period pots 1,000 years before it was written in the form we have, and some of the imagery goes back to the pre-classic murals. But every original copy was destroyed, and the version we have exists because, somewhere around the middle of the 1500s, a small group of Quiché nobles who had learned the Latin alphabet from the friars sat down and used that alphabet to write their own book out in their own language, secretly, and hid it. Nearly 2 centuries later, in the town of Chichicastenango, a Dominican priest named Francisco Ximenez, who was fluent in Quiché and beloved enough that people trusted him, was shown the hidden manuscript. Instead of burning it, he copied it, in 2 columns, Quiché on one side and Spanish on the other, and that copy is the only reason the book exists at all. The original vanished again. Ximenez's copy sat forgotten in a monastery, was rediscovered in the 1800s, wandered through Europe, and now lives in a library in Chicago. Here is what it says, in outline told gently, because it is a good story to fall asleep inside. In the beginning there is only the sky, and the sea, and silence, and in the water the makers, and in the sky the shapers, and they think, and they speak the word earth, and the mountains rise out of the water. They make the animals first, and are pleased with them, and then ask them to speak the names of their makers, and the animals can only squawk and howl, and so they are told, kindly enough, that they will be eaten. Then the makers try to build a person out of mud, and the mud person crumbles and dissolves. Then they carve people out of wood, and the wooden people walk and talk and multiply and fill the earth, but they have no memory and no gratitude and no hearts, and so a flood comes, and their own dogs and their own grinding stones and their own cooking pots rise up against them, complaining about how they have been treated, which is a detail so unexpectedly funny and so unexpectedly moral that it stays with you. The survivors of the wooden people are the monkeys in the trees. Meanwhile, in the middle of all this come the hero twins. Their father and uncle were ball players, noisy ones, and the lords of the underworld, who could not sleep for the thumping, summoned them down to Xibalba and killed them, and hung the father's severed head in a calabash tree. A young woman of the underworld came to look at the tree, and the head spoke to her and spat into her palm, and she conceived, and she fled to the surface, and she bore twins. The twins grew up with their grandmother, mistreated by their older half-brothers, whom they eventually turn into monkeys, and they find their father's old ball gear hidden in the rafters of the house, and they begin to play, and they are just as loud as their father, and the lords of the underworld summon them down in exactly the same way. And this is where the story turns, because the twins are clever. They pass the tests. They survive the House of Knives by talking the knives into stopping. They survive the House of Cold, and the House of Jaguars by throwing bones for the jaguars to fight over, and the House of Bats, though one twin loses his head in it and has to have a substitute carved out of a squash until he can get his own back. They play ball against the lords and win. And in the end they defeat death by a trick so audacious that it is still delightful. They allow themselves to be killed and their bones ground and scattered in the river, and they come back, and they travel through Xibalba as a pair of ragged entertainers doing miracles, dancing, burning a house and restoring it, killing a dog and bringing it back, and finally sacrificing one another and returning to life, and the lords of death, watching this, become so enchanted that they demand to be done as well. So the twins kill them and do not bring them back. Death is not abolished. It is simply demoted, made subject to rules, cut down to a size a human being can live alongside. And the twins rise into the sky as the sun and the moon. Only after all this do the makers finally succeed with people. They find at the mountain of sustenance, brought to them by a fox, a coyote, a parrot and a crow, white maize and yellow maize. The grandmother grinds it 9 times. She mixes the dough with water, and out of that dough the first 4 men are made, and they are so perfect that they can see to the 4 corners of creation and understand everything, and this alarms their makers, who breathe mist onto their eyes so that they see only what is near, the way we do. Then their wives are made while they sleep, and they wake and are glad, and the human race begins. Human beings are made of maize, not clay, not blood, not the tears of a god. Maize ground by a grandmother in a kitchen. The gods of the Maya were many, and they shifted and merged and had aspects. And the same god could be young and old and male and female at different moments, which is why the older attempts to draw a tidy chart of the pantheon always failed. The high god was Itzamna, the old one, patron of writing and healing and the day, sometimes shown as an ancient man with a hooked nose and no teeth, sometimes as a great bird. His counterpart was the moon goddess, young, with a rabbit in her arms, mistress of weaving and childbirth and medicine, which is why the Maya, like most of Asia, see a rabbit in the moon rather than a face. Chaak was the rain, wielding a lightning axe, and his image, with the long curling snout, is the mask repeated 100 times across the front of the northern palaces. Because in a country with no rivers, you can never put up too many pictures of the rain. Kawil was the lightning and the lineage, with a smoking torch through his forehead and 1 leg ending in a serpent, and kings held him in their hands as a sceptre. And in the middle of all of them, the young maize god, the most beautiful figure in Maya art, a slender youth with a long head like a ripe ear, who is killed and buried and rises again with the crop, and whose emergence from a cracked turtle shell, helped up by the twins, is painted on 100 pots. To keep track of all of this there were specialists, and there still are. The daykeeper counts the 260 days, casts red seeds and crystals on a cloth to answer questions, names the newborn for their day, and knows the character of each of the 20-day signs the way a farmer knows the weather. Ordinary religion happened at home, at a small altar, with copal incense, the pale resin of a tree, which burns with a sweet clean smell and rises in white smoke, and there is not a ceremony anywhere in the Maya world today, Catholic or otherwise, that does not begin with someone lighting copal. That smoke is the oldest continuous thread in this entire story. It was rising in the plazas of El Mirador. It is rising tonight, in a doorway in Chiapas, in front of a cross that is also a tree. Let us go back now to Tikal, which we left in disgrace, silent for 130 years under the shadow of the snake. Around the year 682 a man came to the throne there, whose name reads Jasar Chan Kawil, and who is, if this story has a hero in the ordinary sense, probably him. He inherited a great old city that had not carved a monument in living memory, ringed by hostile clients of Calakmul, some of them close enough to see from the temple tops. The first thing he did was to begin carving again, and the very first monument he raised deliberately imitated the style of the old stele from before the defeat, in the way that a family recovering its fortunes might take the good furniture out of storage. Then, on a day corresponding to the 5th of August, in the year 695 of the Common Era, he defeated Calakmul in open battle. The text records the capture of the Snake King's war palanquin, a great litter carrying an effigy of a patron god, which was the equivalent of taking the standard and the crown together, and that palanquin was afterward paraded at Tikal and carved onto a wooden lintel so that everyone who walked into the temple could see it. Calakmul did not end that day. It kept going for decades, but the ring around Tikal broke, and the balance of the Maya world tipped back, and it never tipped again. What Jasar Chan Kawil did with the rest of his reign is what you see in every photograph of Tikal. He and his son rebuilt the centre of the city on a scale nobody had attempted in centuries, raising 6 great temple pyramids of the steep, narrow, almost vertical Tikal type. Each one a stack of terraces climbing to a small building at the summit crowned with a towering roof comb. The tallest of them, the one archaeologists call Temple 4, rises about 70 meters from its base, and for well over 1,000 years it was the tallest building in the Americas. Standing at the top of it at dawn, above the canopy, with mist lying in the low ground and the crests of the other temples poking out of the green like islands, is one of the experiences that changes people, and the howler monkeys begin their morning roar somewhere below you in the dark, and the sound comes up through the trees like weather. He built Temple 1 on the east side of the Great Plaza, and under it he built his own tomb. And when they opened it, they found him lying on a mat with 180 worked pieces of jade, a great collar of beads, pearls, spondylus shell, painted pots, and a set of carved bones incised with such fine images, canoes carrying gods across the water, a hand emerging from the jaws of a beast holding a brush, that they are among the most exquisite objects to survive from the ancient Americas. His widow, or possibly his mother, was buried beneath Temple 2, directly opposite, so that the 2 pyramids face each other across the plaza in a permanent conversation. That was the top of the arc. The 8th century, from roughly the year 700 to the year 790, is the Maya classic at full stretch, and if you could hover above the southern lowlands in that century, you would see something that no one alive today has ever seen and no photograph exists of. Not ruins in a forest. A worked landscape, cleared country from horizon to horizon, terraced hills, drained wetlands laid out in rectangles, orchards, causeways running white across the green, reservoirs shining, smoke from 10,000 cooking fires, and rising out of it every 15 or 20 kilometers, another cluster of red and white pyramids and palaces catching the sun. 60 or 70 kingdoms, several million people, an unbroken web of roads and river routes and market days and marriage alliances. Painted books in every noble house, ball games and feasts and processions and the smell of copal. It was, by any measure you care to use, one of the most sophisticated societies on the planet at that moment, and it had been running, in one form or another, for well over 1,000 years. And it was, at that same moment, standing on very thin ice. Here is the situation in the year 750, told plainly. The population is at its absolute maximum, higher than that landscape has ever carried or will ever carry again. Higher than the same territory carries today. Almost all the good land is in use, and a great deal of marginal land besides, including slopes that should never have been cleared. Forest cover across the central lowlands has been reduced enormously, partly for fields and firewood, and partly for the lime kilns, because every plastered building in every city has to be resurfaced every generation, and the appetite of that habit for timber is nearly bottomless. The soil on the high ground is thinning and washing into the bayhos. The whole food system rests on one crop that everybody plants at the same time, and that fails, when it fails, for everyone at once. The cities have no significant grain stores capable of carrying a large population through consecutive bad years, because maize does not keep well in the humidity. Political competition has intensified from a game of prestige into something closer to a scramble, with client kingdoms breaking away, more capture events recorded than in any previous century, walls going up. And the entire legitimacy of the system rests on the personal claim of about 70 men that they, through their bodies and their rituals and their ancestors, keep the rain coming. Now change one variable. Make it stop raining. The record for what happened next comes from several independent places, and they agree with one another, which is what gives the argument its force. In the 1990s, a team drilled cores from the sediment at the bottom of Lake Chisincanab in the northern Yucatan. The lake is closed, with no outlet, so when evaporation exceeds rainfall, the water becomes more concentrated and gypsum precipitates out and settles on the bottom. And when the rains are good, the gypsum layers thin. Reading down through those layers is like reading a rain gauge that has been running for 8,000 years. The core showed a pronounced dry interval centered on the 9th century, the driest of the entire record. Then came the caves. In Belize, in a cave system in the Vaca Plateau, a stalagmite had been growing for 2,000 years, one thin film of mineral at a time, fed by water dripping through the rock above, and the chemistry of each layer records the amount of rainfall in the year it formed. It can be dated to within a few years, in some stretches to within one. That record showed a long drying trend beginning around the year 660, then a series of severe multi-year droughts in the 9th century, and then, later, an even harsher dry spell in the 1100s. Other cores from other lakes, from the Cariaco Basin off Venezuela, from ocean sediments in the Gulf, all point the same way. Between roughly the year 800 and the year 930, rainfall in the Maya lowlands may have fallen by something on the order of a quarter to a half in the worst years, and the dry spells arrived several times, spaced a decade or so apart, so that just as a community had rebuilt, it was hit again. That is the shape of the disaster. Not a single dramatic year, which any society can survive, but a slow grinding sequence of them across 3 generations, in a landscape that had already spent all its reserves. So what did it look like, from inside, to live through the end of the classic Maya world? Not like an ending, is the first thing to say. It looked like a bad decade, followed by a decent one, followed by a worse one. It looked like the reservoir at your city being lower in April than anyone could remember, and then 3 years later, lower still. It looked like the second planting failing, and the price of everything at market going strange, and your neighbour taking his family to his wife's relatives on the coast, because they have fish there. It looked like a king commissioning a monument, and the stone being smaller and more crudely cut than his father's, and the text on it shorter. It looked like a temple being repaired with stones robbed from an older temple instead of new ones from the quarry, and then not being repaired at all. It looked like fewer painted pots and coarser ones. It looked, in the last generation of some cities, like people moving into the palace, the actual royal palace, and lighting cooking fires on its floors, which archaeologists find as a layer of ash and household rubbish on top of polished plaster, and which is the single most poignant signature of the whole period. The court is gone. The building is still dry and cool and has a roof. Somebody moved in. The monument record thins in a way that can be counted, and the counting is the best evidence we have. Around the year 790, some 19 separate kingdoms in the southern lowlands erected dated monuments to mark the ends of calendar periods, which was the fundamental obligation of a Maya king. 20 years later, that number had dropped. By the year 830, it was down to about a dozen. By the year 860, 3, the last dated monument in the whole southern lowlands, is at Tonina, a hill city in the Chiapas highlands, and its date corresponds to the year 909 of the Common Era. After that, nothing. Not one carved date, anywhere, ever again in that region. Different cities died in different ways and at different times, and this is important because it undercuts every single cause theory taken alone. The Petexbatan kingdoms in the southwest went first and went violently. Walls and burning and abandonment in the 760s, half a century before anybody else. And drought does not explain that, war does. Palenque and the western cities faded around the turn of the 9th century, quietly, without violence. Copan in the southeast held its valley population for perhaps a century after its last king, thinning slowly. Tikal's last monument falls around the year 869, and people were still living in the ruins of Tikal in small numbers well into the 10th century, squatting in the great courts, burying their dead in the collapsing rooms of the palace, burning incense in front of monuments they could probably still read. Caracal was abandoned around the year 890, and the region that had held several million people, within about 150 years, held perhaps a tenth of that. What happened to the people is the question everyone asks, and the honest answer has 3 parts. Some died. Skeletal evidence from the final decades shows worsening nutrition, more anemia, more disease, shorter lives, and there is no version of a multi-decade drought in a crowded landscape that does not involve hunger and the illnesses that follow hunger, particularly among the young. Some went to smaller settlements nearby and simply stopped being visible to us, because a family living in a thatched house in the forest and cooking in plain pots leaves almost nothing that an archaeologist can date, and it is very likely that we have been undercounting these people for a century, and many of them walked. North to the Yucatan, where the cenotes still had water because the water was underground and did not evaporate, and where cities were at that very moment growing rapidly. East to the Caribbean coast and the Cays, where there was salt and fish and a canoe trade that was expanding. South into the highlands, where the rainfall was more reliable and the volcanic soil was deep. It was not a stampede, it was 3 generations of quiet, sensible individual decisions to go where things were better, which is the same decision people make in every century, including this one. Consider the psychology of it for a moment, gently, because it explains why nobody rebuilt. Maya kingship was a contract with a very specific clause in it. The Holy Lord bleeds, dances, feeds the ancestors, and in return the rain comes and the maize grows. That is not a metaphor, and it was not understood as one. Now imagine you are a farmer whose father saw one bad drought and whose grandfather saw one, but who has himself now lived through 15 years in which the rain has arrived late and thin every single year, and buried 2 children, and watched the lord of the city perform the ceremonies faithfully and beautifully and expensively, over and over, with no result whatever. At some point you do not rebel. Rebellion requires believing that a different king would do better. You simply stop going. You stop bringing the tribute maize. You stop turning out for the labour draft. You stop attending the dances. And one day you take your family and your seed corn and you leave. And the reason the great courts ended is that enough people quietly decided the same thing over enough years that there was nobody left to haul the stone. There is direct evidence for this loss of faith in the archaeology. At several sites the last acts recorded are the ritual destruction or burial of the sacred objects of kingship, and at others the thrones were smashed, and at Piedras Negras a stone throne carved with the king's portrait was deliberately broken into pieces and the fragments left where they fell. Somebody was angry. Elsewhere, nobody was angry at all, and the court simply walked away and the doors were left open. And then the forest came back, and it came back fast. In a tropical rainforest, a cleared field left alone is impassable scrub in 3 years and a young forest in 20. Lime plaster, however hard, is porous, and seeds lodge in it, and the roots of a strangler fig will lift a 2-ton block of limestone as gently and irresistibly as a person lifting a lid. Within a century the plazas were closed over. Within 2, the buildings were mounds with trees on them. The great causeways became long, low ridges you could walk along without knowing. And it is here, in the space between the 9th century and the modern world, that we should say something about what those ruins were during all that time, because the popular story is that they were lost, and they were not. The Maya did not forget where their cities were. Post-classic people made pilgrimages to Tikal and Copan and left offerings there, incense burners set at the foot of stelae, small caches of pottery, centuries after the last king. Colonial documents mention the ruins as known places. Local families farmed around them, named them, told stories about them, and used their stone for house platforms and church walls. When explorers from Europe and the United States finally arrived in the 1800s and asked to be taken to the ruined cities, they were taken there, promptly, by local Maya guides who knew exactly where they were and how to get in, and who are almost never named in the resulting books. A city is only lost if you were not there in the first place. While the southern courts were falling quiet, something quite different was happening 200 kilometers to the north, and this is the part of the story that almost never gets told, because it does not fit the shape of a tragedy. The Yucatan was booming. Start with Coba, in the eastern part of the peninsula, set among 5 shallow lakes in flat scrub forest. Coba was old, already substantial in the classic period, and it grew to hold perhaps 50,000 people. What makes it remarkable is its roads. Koba is the hub of the largest network of causeways in the Maya world, more than 50 of them radiating outward, and one of them is simply extraordinary. It runs west, dead straight, for 100 kilometers, all the way to a city called Yaksuna, near the center of the peninsula. 100 kilometers of raised, leveled, plastered road, built by hand, across flat cast scrub, deviating hardly at all, with small ramps at intervals and a stone roller found abandoned along it that weighs about 5 tons. Nobody has ever fully explained why. There were no vehicles. It is likely to have been as much a political statement as a transport link, a line drawn across the map in white plaster saying that everything between these 2 points belongs to one authority. But whatever the reason, it was built, and much of it is still there under the trees. Then comes the Puk. The word means hills, and it refers to a low range of limestone ridges in the northwest of the peninsula, in a district with no cenotes at all, and consequently no surface water and no groundwater within reach. The only way to live there was to catch rain and keep it, and so the Puk cities are built over enormous underground cisterns called choltinob, bottle-shaped chambers cut into the bedrock, plastered watertight, with a small round mouth and a paved catchment sloping toward it. Every household had one. A city might have thousands. That is the whole basis of the place, and in that unpromising country. Between roughly the year 750 and the year 950, the Maya built the most refined architecture they ever produced. Puk style is instantly recognizable, and it is beautiful in a way that is almost modern. The buildings are long and low, horizontal rather than vertical, standing on platforms. The lower half of each facade is left plain, smooth, cut stone, no ornament at all. Then a moulding runs across, and above it the entire upper facade explodes into an intricate mosaic of thousands of small, precisely cut stones, assembled into lattices, step frets, columns, and above all rank upon rank of masks of the rain god, with his long curling snout. Whole corners of buildings are made of nothing but stacked rain god masks, 3, 4, 5 high, snouts curling out into the air, and at Kaaba there is a palace whose entire front, every square centimetre of it, is covered in about 250 of them. The most obsessive facade in the ancient Americas, put up by people who had no water and thought about nothing else. Uxmal is the great city of this style, and one of the loveliest places on earth. Its Pyramid of the Magician is unique among Maya pyramids in having rounded, oval sides, so that it looks less like a stack of boxes and more like a great smooth loaf standing in the trees, with a steep stair up the west face ending at a doorway framed as the open mouth of a monster. Its nunnery quadrangle, so nicknamed by a Spanish friar who thought the many small rooms looked like cells, is 4 long buildings around a courtyard, each facade different, each a masterpiece of mosaic, with the north building raised highest and the whole composition arranged so that when you enter through the arch at the south, you are standing in a room made of buildings. Its governor's palace, on a huge artificial platform, is a single structure almost 100 meters long, with a facade of extraordinary restraint and precision, and it is oriented differently from everything else at the site, turned about 20 degrees off, so that its central doorway aligns with the point on the horizon where Venus rises at its southernmost extreme. An event that happens once every 8 years. Around it are Kaaba with its mask palace and its freestanding monumental arch, Sayil with a 3-story palace of colonnaded galleries, Labna with an arch so gracefully proportioned it has been photographed by everyone who has ever been there, and dozens of smaller sites, all connected, all built in the same idiom within about 2 centuries. Nothing about this is decline. This is a regional renaissance happening at exactly the moment when, 400 kilometers to the south, the last stelae were being carved and the last kings were losing their grip. And there is one more twist to the Puk story, which is that it too ended. Sometime in the 10th or 11th century, the Puk cities were also abandoned, some of them with buildings visibly unfinished, stones dressed and stacked and never set. The same cave records that show the 9th century droughts show a further severe dry period afterward, and the northern cities, entirely dependent on stored rainwater with no underground reserve at all, may simply have been more vulnerable to the second blow than the first. Which brings us, at last, to the city that most people picture when they hear the word Maya, and it is the strangest and most argued over site in the whole region. Chichen Itza sits in the flat northern plain, and its name means at the mouth of the well of the Itza, because it grew up around two enormous cenotes. It became, during the 9th and 10th centuries, the dominant power of the north, and it did so by being something new. Its art and architecture are a fusion. Alongside the classic Maya vaults and mask facades of the older southern part of the site, there are colonnaded halls with flat wooden roofs, feathered serpent columns, reclining stone figures with a dish on the belly, low platforms carved with rows of skulls and processions of warriors, all of which have close counterparts 1,000 kilometers away in central Mexico. For a long time this was explained as a conquest, an invasion of Toltec warriors from the city of Tula sweeping down and taking over. That explanation has largely collapsed, partly because the dating turned out to be wrong, with much of the supposedly late Toltec construction now known to overlap with the supposedly early Maya construction, and partly because in several cases the influence appears to run the other way, from Yucatan to central Mexico. What Chichen looks like now is not a conquered city, but a cosmopolitan one, a trading power plugged into a network that ran up the Gulf Coast and around the peninsula and down to Honduras, governed possibly not by a single divine king in the old style, but by some form of council of noble lineages, which would explain why it has so few of the standard royal portrait stelae and so many long colonnaded halls that look very much like places where a large number of important men sat down together. At the centre of Chichen Itza stands the building everyone knows, a square-stepped pyramid with a stairway up each of its four faces and a squat temple on top, standing alone in the middle of a vast flat plaza of white gravel with nothing else near it. The Maya called it something we do not know for certain. The Spanish called it the castle, and the name stuck, so it is El Castillo. It is not tall, only about 30 meters, and it is not the largest thing at the site, but it may be the most thoroughly designed building the Maya ever made, because it is a calendar rendered as a solid object. Each of the four stairways has 91 steps. 4 times 91 is 364, and the platform at the top is the last step, making 365, one for every day of the year. Each face is divided into 9 terraces, and the stairway cuts each face in 2, giving 18 panels per side, 1 for each month of the vague year. On the sides of the terraces are 52 recessed panels, 1 for each year of the calendar round, and it is oriented so that on the afternoons around the spring and autumn equinoxes, the stepped corner of the northwest terrace casts a series of triangular shadows onto the side of the northern balustrade, and those triangles line up into an undulating body of light which connects, at the bottom of the stair, with a great carved stone serpent head sitting on the ground. For about 40 minutes on those afternoons, a snake made of sunlight comes down the pyramid. Thousands of people go to watch it every year. Inside that pyramid, in the way of Maya buildings, is an earlier pyramid, complete, swallowed whole, and in the temple at the top of the inner one archaeologists found a stone jaguar throne painted bright red with jade discs for its spots, and a mosaic disc of turquoise resting on it. And inside that inner pyramid, discovered by careful electrical imaging in recent years, there appears to be a third, still earlier structure, built directly over a cenote. 3 buildings nested like a set of boxes over a hole in the world. 400 meters north of the pyramid, at the end of a broad causeway, is the sacred cenote, a near circular shaft about 60 meters across with sheer walls dropping 20 meters to green water. This was a place of offering for centuries, and it went on being one long after the city itself declined. with pilgrims coming from all over the peninsula and beyond. Between 1904 and 1910 an American consul dredged it, and later divers went down, and what came up was a catalogue of the post-classic world. Thousands of pieces of jade, gold discs beaten flat and incised with battle scenes, and gold bells and copper, all of it imported since neither metal occurs there, some of it from as far away as Colombia and Panama. Rubber figures, wooden objects preserved in the airless mud, incense burners full of copal, some still holding blue pigment, textiles and human remains of adults and of the young, though far fewer than the lurid early accounts claimed, and the isotope work on those bones shows that many of the people came from a long way away. Around the year 1200, Chichen Itza's dominance ended, and power passed to a walled city 40 kilometers to the west, called Mayapan. Mayapan is the last capital of the independent northern Maya, and it is a curious place, roughly 4 square kilometers inside a defensive wall, packed with more than 4,000 buildings crammed together with almost no planning, and at its center a smaller, cruder copy of El Castillo, as if the builders were quoting a prestigious original from memory. The later Yucatec chronicles say that the noble families of the whole region agreed to govern jointly from Mayapan, and that each lineage kept a household inside the walls, which sounds like a federation, and was probably also a way of keeping potential rivals where they could be watched. It worked for about 250 years, and then, in the 1440s, the arrangement broke apart in a revolt of one noble house against another, and Mayapan was sacked and burned and left. What followed in the century before the Europeans arrived was a Yucatan divided into 16 or so small independent provinces, quarrelling with each other, trading vigorously, and with no central authority of any kind. Along the Caribbean coast the trade towns flourished, and one of them, on a low cliff above turquoise water, with a wall on the landward side and a small temple perched right at the cliff edge, is the postcard of the Mexican Caribbean today. Its ancient name may have been Zama, meaning dawn, because it faces the sunrise. We call it Tulum. It was a working port, receiving canoes carrying salt and honey and cotton and cacao and obsidian around the peninsula, and it was still occupied and busy when the first Spanish ships went past it in 1518, and the sailors reported a town as large as Seville, which was an exaggeration born of nerves, but they were certainly looking at a living, painted, inhabited city. The Maya had known that something was coming for a while before it came. The first contact was in the year 1502, out at sea, when the trading canoe met the European ships off the coast of Honduras, and both parties traded politely and separated. Then, in 1511, a Spanish ship was wrecked in the Caribbean, and about a dozen survivors reached the Yucatan coast in a boat. Most died. 2 lived for years among the Maya, and their 2 fates are one of the strangest small stories in the history of the Americas. One was a priest called Geronimo de Aguilar, who kept his faith and his language and waited. The other was a sailor called Gonzalo Guerrero, who learned Yucatec Maya, married the daughter of a lord at Chetumal, had 3 children, tattooed his face, pierced his ears, and became a war captain. When Cortés arrived in 1519 and sent word that any Christians in the interior should come to him, Aguilar came and became the first link in the chain of interpreters that made the conquest of Mexico possible. Guerrero sent back a reply which the chroniclers preserved, to the effect that he was married, that his face was tattooed and his ears pierced, that his children were beautiful, and that he could not go. He is believed to have died years later fighting the Spanish, on the Maya side, somewhere in Honduras. He is the first European settler in the Americas, and he settled the wrong way round. And in Mexico today there are statues of him. The conquest of the Maya took the Spanish 170 years, which is longer than they needed for any other part of the Americas, and the reason is exactly the thing that had always defined the Maya world. There was no capital to take. When you conquer an empire, you seize the center, you take the emperor, and the machinery of the state becomes yours in an afternoon. That is what happened in central Mexico and in Peru. But there was no Maya emperor to capture and no single throne to sit on. There were dozens of small, prickly, independent polities in difficult country, and each one had to be dealt with separately, and each one could be beaten and then simply melt into the forest and reform somewhere else. It began badly for the Spanish. In 1517, an expedition under Francisco Hernández de Córdoba landed on the north coast of Yucatan, was attacked, lost half its men, and its commander died of his wounds shortly after returning to Cuba. A second expedition the following year did better and traded, and reported the towns along the coast. The first serious attempt at conquest, from 1527, was led by Francisco de Montejo, and it failed. His second attempt through the 1530s also failed, and at one point the Spanish were driven out of the peninsula entirely. It was his son and his nephew, both also called Francisco de Montejo, who finally established a foothold, founding the city of Mérida in 1542, directly on top of the ruins of a Maya town whose cut stone they quarried for their cathedral, which is why the Cathedral of Mérida, one of the oldest in the Americas, is built out of a Maya city. Even then it took until 1546 to put down a general revolt in the east, and the southern forests were never really subdued at all. In the highlands to the south it went faster and much more brutally. Pedro de Alvarado came down from Mexico in 1524 with a small Spanish force and thousands of indigenous allies from central Mexico, and exploited the long-standing hostility between the Quiche and the Kaqchikel, allying with one to destroy the other and then turning on his ally. The Quiche capital of Cumarcaj was burned, but even here the conquest was ragged and partial and took decades to complete in the remoter mountains. And the deciding factor, in the highlands as everywhere in the Americas, was not steel or horses. It was disease. Smallpox reached the Maya world ahead of the Spanish themselves, moving along the trade routes from central Mexico, and it was followed by measles, influenza, typhus and later cholera, striking populations with no inherited resistance whatever. The Kaqchikel Chronicles, written by Maya nobles in their own language shortly after the events, describe an epidemic sweeping through in 1520 and 1521, before the Spanish arrived, with a plainness that is very hard to read. They record that it began with a cough, then nosebleeds and bladder illness, that the smell of the dead was everywhere, that the grandfathers and the fathers died, and they give the date. Estimates of population loss across the region over the century following contact run from 70 to 90%. That is the true conquest, and no army did it. Now to the fire. In the town of Mani, in northern Yucatan, on a day in July in the year 1562, a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa held a ceremony of penance. Landa had come to Yucatan as a young man, learned the language thoroughly, travelled the province, and become provincial head of his order. He had discovered that Maya converts were continuing to venerate their own gods alongside the new one, in caves and in the fields, and he responded with an inquisition that used torture on a large scale, and at the end of it he burned every Maya book he could gather. He wrote about it himself with a kind of puzzled regret that makes it worse, saying that they contain nothing but superstition and falsehoods of the devil, and that the people regretted their loss to an astonishing degree, and it caused them much affliction. Something in the region of 27 books went into that fire. Others were burned elsewhere by others. The libraries of a literate civilization, the histories, the astronomy, the medicine, the songs, the genealogies going back centuries were gone in an afternoon or two of afternoons, and of everything the Maya ever wrote on paper, 4 books survive, and they survive because they had been carried to Europe as curiosities before the burnings and forgotten in libraries. The Dresden Codex, the finest of them, the one with the Venus tables, was bought in Vienna in 1739 and nearly destroyed again in the bombing of Dresden in 1945, when water damage warped several pages. The Madrid Codex, the longest. The Paris Codex, a fragment found in a basket of old papers by a chimney in the Imperial Library in 1800 659, and a fourth, smaller and rougher, which surfaced in private hands in the 1960s and was widely dismissed as a forgery for 50 years, until scientific analysis of its paper and pigments and a fresh look at its content established it as genuine and, in fact, the oldest of the four. And here is the twist that history occasionally supplies to soften a wound. Landa was recalled to Spain to answer for the excesses of his Inquisition, and while defending himself he wrote a long account of everything he had learned about the Maya, their calendar, their farming, their marriages, their festivals, their buildings, their food. And in it, trying to understand their writing, he sat down with a Maya informant and asked him to write the letters of the Spanish alphabet. The informant, hearing the name of a letter, wrote the Maya syllable that sounded like it. So that when Landa said the letter B, his informant wrote the sign for the syllable B, and so on down the list, with several signs offered for some sounds. Landa concluded that this was an alphabet, which it was not, and copied it into his manuscript, where it sat misunderstood for 300 years. That short list is what finally cracked the writing open. The man who burned the books also, without meaning to, preserved the key to reading them. In the far south, meanwhile, in the middle of a great lake in the Piton, an independent Maya kingdom simply carried on. The Itza had moved there generations earlier, and their capital, Neupetten, stood on an island, with its temples and its idols and its king, entirely beyond Spanish reach. Cortés himself passed through in 1525 on a brutal overland march to Honduras, was received hospitably, and left behind a lame horse which he asked them to care for. The Spanish returned more than a century later to find, according to the story, that the horse had died and the Itza had made a statue of it and were paying it respectful attention, which they took very badly. Missionaries came and were rebuffed politely, and it was not until the 13th of March in the year 1697 that a Spanish force crossed the lake in a built galley under fire and stormed the island. That is the date on which the last independent Maya kingdom fell, and it is worth holding it next to some other dates for scale. By then the city of Boston had existed for nearly 70 years. Isaac Newton had already published his laws of motion. A Maya king with a hereditary title, a book of prophecies and a court of priests was still ruling on that island, while a modern world was already underway elsewhere. The colonial centuries were long and hard and are usually skipped, and they should not be, because the survival of everything we have been talking about happened in them. Maya communities were gathered into new towns laid out on a Spanish grid around a church and a square, a policy called reduction, which broke up the old scattered settlement pattern and made people easier to tax and to instruct. Land was taken. Labour was demanded. The old nobility was partly co-opted, its members becoming the governors and scribes and church stewards of the new towns, which preserved a great deal more continuity than the friars intended. And underneath the new arrangement, the old one went on quietly. The saints in the church acquired the attributes of older powers. The cross, in the highlands and in Chiapas, is often green, and stands in a doorway or on a hilltop, and is dressed in cloth, and is understood by many as a tree, which it always was. The day-keepers went on counting. In the highlands the 260-day round has never once broken, and men and women who hold that office today can tell you which day it is and what its character is. In an unbroken chain of counting that reaches back past the conquest, past the collapse, past the classic period. More than 2,000 years. And the writing did not vanish either. It changed clothes. Across northern Yucatan, in town after town, Maya scribes who had learned the Latin alphabet used it to write their own books in Yucatec Maya, and they called them the Books of Chilam Balam, after a famous prophet whose title means the Jaguar Interpreter. Each town had its own, named for the town, Chumayel, Mani, Tizimin, Kawa, and they are wonderful, chaotic, generous documents. Into them the scribes copied history, prophecy in the old Khatoon cycle, medical recipes, land boundaries, astrology, riddles used to test whether a man was truly of noble descent, calendrical tables, And, sitting quite comfortably next to all of it, Spanish almanac material and Christian devotional texts. They kept being copied and recopied and added to well into the 1800s. They are the sound of a literate tradition refusing to stop, using whatever alphabet is available. That refusal turned into open revolt more than once, and the largest of these is one of the least known long wars in the history of the Americas. In 1847, in the east of Yucatan, the Maya rose against the settler government, and the rising very nearly succeeded, pushing the state forces back to the two largest cities in the peninsula. What followed became known as the Caste War, and it lasted, in one form or another, until the very end of the century and beyond, with an independent Maya state in the eastern forest centered on a shrine town where a wooden cross was said to speak, giving instructions to the faithful. That state had its own generals, its own governance, and its own arms trade through Belize. Mexico did not take the shrine town until 1901, and the last formal agreements with some communities were not made until 1933. It is a striking fact that the longest sustained indigenous resistance in the Americas ended within the lifetime of people who owned radios. And in the middle of all this, in 1839, two travellers arrived. John Lloyd Stephens was an American lawyer and writer with a diplomatic appointment and an appetite for ruins. Frederick Catherwood was an English architect and draughtsman who had already spent years drawing monuments in the Nile Valley and the Levant with obsessive accuracy, using a device called a camera lucida, which projects the image onto the paper so that the hand can trace it. They travelled together through Central America and Yucatan in conditions that were genuinely awful, through a war zone, in the rain, with fever, and Catherwood contracted malaria badly, and drew anyway, sometimes standing in mud with gloves on against the mosquitoes. Stephens bought the ruins of Copan from a local landowner for a sum reported as $50, which is an uncomfortable anecdote, and was at the time simply how such things were done. And then they published. Two books in 1841 and 1843, Stephens writing clear, funny, unpretentious prose, and Catherwood supplying engravings of a precision nobody had seen before, of stelae so detailed that modern epigraphers can still read glyphs from them where the original stone has since weathered away. The books were enormous bestsellers on both sides of the Atlantic, and their central argument, which Stephens made calmly and repeatedly against the fashionable nonsense of his day, was this. These cities were not built by wandering visitors from the Old World, or by a lost tribe of Israel, or by refugees from a sunken continent, or by anyone else from anywhere else. They were built by the ancestors of the people who were, at that moment, carrying his luggage and cooking his supper and guiding him through the forest. He said it plainly, in print, in 1841, and he was completely right, and it took the scholarly world the better part of a century to catch up with him. The 19th century that followed was a mixture of real work and real damage. Sites were mapped and photographed by careful people. Monuments were also sawn off, crated and shipped. An immense number of painted pots came out of tombs through looting, unrecorded, so that their images survive, and their contexts are gone forever. Expeditions arrived from museums in Boston and Chicago and London and Berlin, and the great early institutions of the field were founded, and the first serious efforts to record every inscription began. And through all of it, nobody could read a word. They could see that certain signs recurred, they could tell that some passages were dates, because in 1880 a librarian in Dresden named Ernst Forstermann, who had the Dresden Codex in his own collection and simply sat with it for years, worked out the bar and dot numbers, the zero, the place value system, the structure of the long count, and the Venus table, all of it, without knowing a single word of any Mayan language, purely from internal mathematical logic. It is one of the great feats of pure reasoning in the history of scholarship, done by a man in a library in Saxony who had never been within 5,000 kilometers of a Maya city. So by the early 20th century we could read the dates and the astronomy perfectly, and nothing else at all. And out of that lopsided situation came the great false picture that dominated the field for 50 years. The picture of the Maya as gentle, peaceful, unworldly priest astronomers who lived in empty ceremonial centres, thought about time, and had no politics, no history, no wars, and no individuals. It was asserted with enormous authority by the leading figure of the discipline, and anyone who suggested otherwise was flattened. And it was wrong in almost every particular, and the correction, when it came from two people the establishment did not see coming. The first was a young Russian scholar named Yuri Knurosov. The story that he rescued a book from a burning library in Berlin at the end of the war is romantic and probably not accurate, but he certainly obtained a copy of a published edition of the codices along with Lander's manuscript, and he sat down with them in Leningrad, and he did something nobody in the West had done. He treated the problem as a linguist rather than as an archaeologist. He had worked on other ancient scripts, and he knew from that comparative experience that writing systems invented from scratch almost always end up as a mixture of word signs and syllable signs, and that a script with a few hundred signs, which is what the Maya had, is far too many for an alphabet, and far too few for a purely pictorial system, and lands squarely in the range of a syllabary with logograms. Then he looked again at Lander's so-called alphabet, and realized that the signs were not letters but syllables, exactly as a Maya speaker would have supplied them when asked to write the sound of a Spanish letter name. He took the sign Lander had listed for the letter Q and the sign for the letter Z, and read them together as cuts, which happens to be the Yucatec word for turkey, and the picture beside that glyph in the codex is a turkey. He did the same with another pair and got Sul, meaning dog, and the picture is a dog. He published this in 1952, when he was 30. He was in the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, and the reaction in the West was not scholarly, it was political. The dominant figure in the field dismissed the work publicly and repeatedly. And the fact that Knorosov's paper carried the standard ideological framing required of any Soviet publication of the period was used to discredit the linguistics inside it. He was right, and it took 2 decades for the field to admit it. He was eventually able to visit the Maya area only after the Soviet Union ended, near the end of his life, and there is a photograph of him standing at a Maya site, in a coat, looking not entirely comfortable and entirely triumphant. The second person was Tatiana Proskuryakov, a Russian-born American who had trained as an architect, could not find work in the Depression, and took a job making archaeological drawings, becoming the finest architectural reconstruction artist the field has ever had. Her paintings of Maya cities as they might have looked are still the images most people carry in their heads. And in 1960 she published a short paper about the monuments of one site, Piedras Negras, that broke the whole false picture open in about 15 pages. She had noticed something nobody had thought to look for. The stelae there were not scattered randomly. They stood in groups in front of particular buildings, and within each group the dates fell into a span of never more than about 65 years, which is a human lifetime. In each group the earliest monument showed a figure seated in a niche above a ladder, with a date shortly before it that recurred, and a second date some 12 to 30 years earlier still. She proposed the obvious human explanation. The niche figure is an accession, the person is a ruler, the earlier date is that ruler's birth, and the group of monuments is one reign. She identified the signs for was born and exceeded. She showed that the Maya monuments were not astronomy, not theology, not abstraction, but history, the biographies of individual named human beings. Once you can see that, everything follows, and everything did. Through the 60s and 70s the readings came faster and faster. Heinrich Berlin in Mexico identified the emblem glyphs, and realized each stood for a particular kingdom, which gave the map its names. Scholars gathered at Palenque in the 70s for a series of conferences that were more like a workshop than a congress, and in the space of a few days a group of them reconstructed the entire dynastic sequence of that city, including a king they nicknamed Shield, whom we now call Pakal. A teenage boy who had grown up on excavations, the son of 2 archaeologists, began publishing sign identifications while still at school, and produced a paper at 18 that resolved a fundamental problem about how the same sound could be written with different signs. By the 1990s, the script was substantially readable, and today somewhere upward of 90% of the surviving texts can be read with confidence, and the remaining problems are the ordinary problems of philology, damaged stone, rare signs, ambiguous grammar. We can now stand in front of a monument in a forest and read out, in something close to the original language, the name of the man it portrays, his mother's name, the day he was born, the day he took the throne, and what he did on a particular afternoon 1100 years ago. And then, in 2018, the ground itself was read. A consortium flew aircraft carrying laser scanners over more than 2,000 square kilometers of northern Guatemala, firing pulses down through the canopy, some of which slip between the leaves and reach the forest floor and come back, allowing the trees to be deleted from the data and the bare earth to be seen. What appeared in the first release alone was more than 60,000 structures that no one had known were there, house platforms in their tens of thousands, causeways, reservoirs, agricultural terraces on a scale nobody had suspected, covering whole hillsides, field systems in the wetlands, and, unexpectedly, defensive works, ditches and ramparts and fortified hilltops far from any known city. The population estimates for the central lowlands at their peak had to be revised upwards several times over. Every one of us who had ever looked at a photograph of a temple standing alone in unbroken green had been looking at an optical illusion, and the laser removed it in a single season. So let us come back, gently, to where we began, and finish. There are somewhere between 6 and 7 million Maya people alive tonight. In Guatemala they are a very large share of the population. In some highland departments, the great majority. In the Mexican states of Yucatan, Campeche, Quintana Roo, Chiapas and Tabasco they number in the millions. There are Maya communities in Belize and in Honduras and in El Salvador, and there are substantial Maya communities in Los Angeles and Houston and Florida and Oregon, where you can hear Canjabal and Mam and Quiche spoken in the aisles of grocery stores, carried there by the migrations of recent decades. About 30 distinct Mayan languages are spoken. Children are raised in them. A Guatemalan Quiche woman won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992. Maya writers publish poetry in Yucatec. Maya weavers have taken legal action to protect their designs from commercial copying, arguing, entirely correctly, that those patterns are collective intellectual property inherited from a very long line of women. Farmers plant milpa with a digging stick and a prayer and a bag of hybrid seed and a mobile phone in the pocket, all at once, and see no contradiction in it, because there is none. And a daykeeper in the highlands will tell you what day it is in a count that has run without interruption for over 2,000 years. Which brings us to the last thing, the famous thing, the thing about the end of the world. In December of the year 2012, one of the great cycles of the long count came to an end. 13 of the largest units since the mythological starting point, a span of about 5,125 years. In the years leading up to it, a very large amount of money was made from the idea that the Maya had predicted the end of the world on that date. They had not. They had never said so anywhere. The single ancient monument that mentions the date, a damaged panel from a site in Tabasco, refers to it in the same way a calendar might refer to a distant anniversary alongside a ceremony, and there are other classic period texts which casually project dates thousands of years beyond it, including one at Palenque, which mentions a day more than 4,000 years in our future, which is not the act of a people expecting the world to stop. A cycle ended and a new one began, and the correct response, which is what actually happened, was that Maya communities held ceremonies, lit copal, gave thanks, and got on with things. Because that was always the point. Time in this way of seeing is not a line running out. It is a set of wheels inside wheels, turning at different speeds, and everything that turns comes back. The rain comes back. The maize is buried and rises. The sun goes down into the dark and fights his way through it, and is born again in the east in the morning. Kings die and go into the mountain, and their sons speak to them through a tube of stone. Cities are built and left, and the forest takes them, and people come back and burn incense at their feet. Nothing is ever finally over. Nothing is ever finally lost. 3,000 years of this, and the thread has not broken once. So let it turn. Let the day you had go down into the west like the sun, and let it be finished. And let the next one come up on its own, without any help from you. You do not need to hold anything together tonight. The wheel is quite good at turning by itself. Sleep well. Sleep as long as you like. The forest is warm, the plaster is white in the moonlight, the road runs straight, the fire is banked, and everyone you have ever belonged to is sleeping just below the floor, close enough to hear you breathing. Good night.